Sometimes the mind notices something before you do. A shift in the room, a silence that feels wrong. You tell yourself it's nothing because that's easier. The people in tonight's stories did the same, until they couldn't anymore. I'm Lurk. Leave a like, subscribe, and let's begin. This happened only a couple of weeks ago, and even now, when I think about it, I still get that cold, uneasy feeling in my chest. It's one of those situations where nothing supernatural happens, nothing dramatic on the surface, yet the timing of everything feels so unsettling that it sticks with you. The kind of story where you keep replaying it in your head, thinking about how easily things could have gone very, very wrong. A couple of friends and I had planned a rock climbing trip for the weekend. Nothing extreme, just a few days away from work and responsibilities. We left on Friday afternoon, all of us excited to get out of town. The drive was about 4 hours, mostly highways that slowly turned into quieter roads as we got closer to the climbing area. Somewhere along the drive, I noticed my stomach wasn't feeling great. It wasn't sharp pain at first, just a deep, uncomfortable pressure. The kind of thing you assume is gas, nerves, or something you ate earlier in the day. I didn't mention it to anyone because it didn't feel serious. I figured it would pass once we stopped driving and got some food in us. We arrived at the cabins just before evening. They were simple but cozy, tucked away in the woods. The kind of place where everything is quiet once the sun goes down. No streetlights, no nearby neighbors, just trees and darkness. We unpacked, claimed beds, and decided to light a fire in the fireplace to warm the place up and make it feel more comfortable. The fire burned nicely at first. We sat around, talked, laughed, cooked dinner, and relaxed. Everything felt normal, but my stomach never really settled. It wasn't unbearable, just persistent enough to be annoying. I shifted in my chair a lot, tried different positions, drank water, and told myself it would go away. As the night went on, everyone started getting tired. One by one, my friends headed off to their rooms to sleep. I stayed up longer than everyone else because the discomfort was easier to tolerate when I was sitting upright. Lying down made it feel worse. At some point, I realized I was the only one awake in the cabin. The fire had mostly died down by then. Just a couple of logs were still glowing, resting against each other inside the fireplace. We had closed the glass door but hadn't latched it shut because the fire was almost out. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Eventually, my stomach pains started to feel different, still dull but heavier, more insistent. I figured maybe I just needed to use the bathroom and get whatever was bothering me out of my system. So I went to the bathroom and sat down, hoping that would be the end of it. About 5 minutes later, I heard a sound. A dull thump. At first, I ignored it. Cabins make noises, wood settles, fires shift. I was half distracted and uncomfortable, sitting there with my pants around my ankles, trying to focus on my stomach instead of whatever random noise the cabin had made. A couple of minutes passed, and then it hit me. That sound hadn't come from the walls or the ceiling. It came from the direction of the fireplace. The realization sent a jolt of panic through me. I jumped up instantly, yanking my pants up as I ran out of the bathroom, barely thinking straight. The moment I entered the living room, I was hit with thick smoke. The room was filling fast, the air already heavy and sharp in my lungs. One of the logs had shifted. It had rolled forward, knocked the fireplace door open, and fallen directly onto the rug in front of the fireplace. For a split second, I just stared at it in disbelief. If I'd been even a little later, that rug would have caught fire. If I had already been asleep like everyone else, the cabin could have filled with smoke before anyone noticed. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees, with no easy access to help. Adrenaline took over. I grabbed the log as quickly as I could, shoved it back into the fireplace, and slammed the door shut properly this time. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. I opened windows, fanned the smoke out as best I could, and stood there coughing, trying to calm down. Once the smoke cleared, the reality of what almost happened settled in. That single log could have burned the cabin down. We could have been trapped inside. All because the fire wasn't latched and I happened to be awake at exactly the right moment. As my breathing slowed, the stomach pain came back, sharper now, no longer something I could brush off. I sat down and realized something was seriously wrong. The pain wasn't moving or easing, it was deep and constant. By morning, it was obvious I needed medical help. One of my friends drove me to the nearest town, which was farther away than any of us liked. After tests and scans, the doctors told me exactly what was happening. It was appendicitis. My appendix was inflamed and close to rupturing. I needed surgery right away, lying in that hospital bed afterward. I couldn't stop thinking about the timing of everything, the pain that kept me awake, the reason I didn't go to bed like everyone else, the reason I was sitting on the toilet when the log fell. If my appendix hadn't started acting up, I would have been asleep. No one would have noticed the fire until it was too late. In a strange way, that pain may have saved all of our lives. It's a bizarre thought, and one that still messes with my head. My body literally forced me to stay awake long enough to stop a disaster. Something went wrong inside me, and because of that, something far worse didn't happen. It's been weeks now, and physically I'm fine. The surgery went well. Recovery was rough, but manageable. But mentally, that moment keeps replaying in my head. The sound of the log hitting the floor, the smoke filling the room, the realization of how close we came to disaster. Sometimes it's not the dramatic moments that scare you the most. Sometimes it's realizing how thin the line really is between a normal night and a tragedy, and how sometimes the thing that feels like a problem is actually the reason you're still here. I am finally able to talk about this without shaking with anger or breaking down into tears, but it took years to get here. Even now, writing it out feels heavy. This happened when I was very young, and looking back, I can see how naive I was, how little I understood about the world, and how easily trust can be used as a weapon. When I was 18 years old, I met a man on Facebook. He was 31. At that age, that gap didn't feel as alarming to me as it should have. I was young, insecure, and eager to feel chosen by someone older and more experienced. He seemed impressive on paper. He was ex-military and had done 2 tours overseas. He worked for a well-known farmer in the area, someone people respected. He was also the son of a Methodist preacher. All of that together painted a picture in my mind of a man who was disciplined, grounded, and morally solid. I truly thought I had found someone special, maybe even the one. We talked online for a week or two before he drove out to meet me. When he arrived, everything moved very fast. We drank a handful of beers, laughed, talked, and before I really had time to process what was happening, I slept with him. I didn't see that as strange at the time. It felt exciting and adult. Afterward, he took me home, met my mom, and stayed around for a few more hours like everything was perfectly normal. My mother didn't see anything alarming either. He was polite, charming, and confident. That should have been comforting. Instead, it should have terrified me. That night, after we slept together, I asked him a question that, in hindsight, makes my stomach turn. I asked if I was the youngest girl he had slept with in the bed of his fancy pickup truck, where he had this whole setup with a sleeping bag and blankets. He told me no. At the time, I brushed it off. It didn't hit me as wrong until much later, when everything finally fell apart and I understood what kind of person he really was. Over the next few months, we continued seeing each other. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. He was controlling in subtle ways. He always wanted to know where I was, who I was with. He had strange habits, unexplained absences, and an intensity that I confused with passion. When you're young and desperate to feel loved, you excuse things you should never excuse. A couple of months into our relationship, he met my best friend. She was still a minor. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was charming with everyone. But slowly, I noticed how close they were getting. Too close. Eventually, they started sleeping together. When I found out, I was devastated. I felt betrayed by both of them. But instead of walking away, I twisted myself into knots trying to make it work. I convinced myself that since he wanted her, she wanted me, and I wanted him, we could somehow be one big, messy, happy couple. I told myself that love could be unconventional, that jealousy was something I needed to get over. That decision haunts me. As time went on, he stopped coming to see me as much. He was always with her. I was consumed by jealousy and confusion. At the same time, my best friend started to change. She wasn't herself anymore. She became distant, hollow, and unpredictable. I didn't understand why. I didn't know what was happening behind closed doors. Eventually, he went completely silent on me. No calls, no texts, nothing. I assumed he was just with her. I was hurt, angry, and overwhelmed, so I cut ties with my best friend. That's one of the things I regret the most. I didn't know she was trapped. I didn't know she was being abused. I thought she had chosen him over me. In February of 2015, after 9 days of no contact from him, I finally snapped. I sent him a text. All it said was, "You have made no effort to contact me in 9 days. I think we're done here." He replied with one word, "Oh." That was it. A month later, he was arrested by the local sheriff's department on what was initially described as a drug charge. At first, I didn't think much of it. I thought maybe it was possession, maybe something minor. Then, a couple of weeks later, the truth started coming out. They weren't just arresting him for drugs. They had been building a human trafficking case. Suddenly, everything made sense. The black car I kept seeing everywhere I went, parked near my house, sitting down the street, following me to stores. I thought I was being paranoid. I thought my anxiety was getting the best of me. They were KBI detectives. They were watching my every move. One of the officers involved was actually the best man at my mom and stepdad's wedding. When I realized that, my blood ran cold. This wasn't small. This wasn't simple. I had been involved with someone truly dangerous. My ex took a plea bargain. He is now in prison on charges of distribution and production of child pornography. That alone is horrific, but it barely scratches the surface of what he was actually doing. I later learned that he had been keeping 5 girls around my age, locked in an abandoned barn in the middle of winter. They were isolated, controlled, abused, and trafficked. And then came the worst realization of all. My best friend had been one of his victims. I learned years later that he had been injecting her with drugs, shooting her up until she was barely conscious. While she was out of her mind, he would sneak men through her bedroom window to have sex with her. She never told me. She never said a word because she knew how much I loved him and didn't want to hurt me. After everything came out, she was taken to a home for human trafficking victims, where she stayed until she turned 18. She survived something no one should ever have to survive. I carry an immense amount of guilt for not seeing it sooner, for not protecting her, for not listening to my instincts. Hindsight is cruelly clear. The signs were there. The age gap, the secrecy, the control, the way he isolated people, the way he made himself seem safe and respectable. If I ever see that man again, I don't know what I would do. I know the rage still lives somewhere inside me. He destroyed lives. He shattered families. He robbed young girls of their safety, their bodies, and their innocence. I am grateful every day that I never got pregnant during that time, even though we were trying. I am grateful I survived. I am beyond grateful that my best friend survived. This experience changed me forever. It taught me that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like veterans. Sometimes they look like church kids. Sometimes they look like charming men with good jobs and polite smiles. Be careful who you let into your life. Be careful with friend requests, even if they're only from a town or two away. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the safest. Story 15. It happened one summer in the 1980s, back when I was about 10 years old. School was out, the days felt endless, and life still had that slow, dreamy quality that only childhood summers seemed to have. That year, I went with my grandmother to visit my uncle, her son, who lived in upstate New York. For me, it felt like a small adventure. We were leaving behind the familiar and going somewhere quieter, greener, and a little mysterious. My uncle lived in an old house with a few roommates. The house itself wasn't anything fancy, but what made it unusual was where it sat. The back of the property connected directly to an old cemetery that dated back to the early 1800s. The gravestones were weathered and crooked, some barely readable, half sunk into the ground after centuries of rain and snow. As a kid, I knew it was supposed to be creepy, but at the time it didn't really scare me. It just felt old, like the place had stories in it. During the day, when my uncle and his roommates were at work, it was usually just my grandmother and me at the house. She would be inside doing crossword puzzles, reading, or cooking, and I would spend hours on the front porch. They had one of those wicker swinging chairs, the kind shaped like a dome, suspended from the ceiling. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. I would sit in it with a stack of comic books, gently swinging back and forth, completely lost in my own little universe. One afternoon, while I was sitting there reading, I happened to glance through the screen door into the living room. That's when I saw him. There was a man sitting on the couch. He was wearing a black and red flannel shirt. He had thick black hair and a full beard. He looked solid, real, and completely normal. He wasn't staring at me or doing anything strange. He was just sitting there, relaxed, like he belonged there. I didn't feel scared at all. I remember thinking, very casually, that he must be one of my uncle's roommates that I hadn't met yet, or maybe a friend who had stopped by. That house always seemed to have new people coming and going. It didn't strike me as odd. I went back to my comic book, finished reading it, and after a few minutes I decided to go inside. When I walked through the screen door and into the living room, the couch was empty. The man was gone. I remember pausing for a second, looking around, but again, I didn't think much of it. I assumed he had gone into another room or stepped outside. I didn't ask my grandmother about it. I didn't tell anyone. The moment passed, and like so many small, strange moments in childhood, it simply slipped into the background of my memory and stayed there, untouched, for years. Life moved on. I grew up. I went to school, became an adult, built a life. That summer in upstate New York became just another childhood memory, soft around the edges, something I rarely thought about. The man on the couch faded into the blur of old recollections, filed away with 1,000 other forgotten details. Then, many years later, in the late 1990s, my uncle came down to visit us. By then, I was fully grown, with my own family. We all went out to eat together, sitting around a table, talking, laughing, reminiscing about the past. At some point, the conversation turned to that old house in upstate New York. My uncle started telling stories. He talked about the cemetery behind the house and how strange things used to happen there. He mentioned that one of his roommates had moved out very suddenly. According to him, she had been standing at the kitchen sink one day, washing dishes, when she looked out the window and saw two children in the yard, a boy and a girl. They were standing close together, waving at her, motioning for her to come outside and play. At first, she ignored them and kept washing dishes, but after a moment, it hit her how strange that was. There were no other houses nearby, no families with kids. So she dried her hands and went outside to see who they were. The children were gone. In the exact spot where they had been standing were two old gravestones, one marked for a young boy, the other for a young girl. According to the dates, they had died in the 1800s, possibly from smallpox or another illness common at the time. After that, she packed her things and moved out almost immediately. Everyone at the table listened quietly. Then my uncle continued. He said that he himself used to see something too. Not directly, but out of the corner of his eye. He would be sitting on the couch watching television when he'd catch a glimpse of a man sitting at the far end of the couch. Every time he tried to look straight at him, the figure would vanish. But the details were always the same. A black and red flannel shirt, thick black hair, a beard. The moment he said that, everything inside me dropped. I let out a loud gasp without meaning to. My fork slipped out of my hand and clattered onto the table. My jaw literally went slack. I could feel all the color drain from my face. The room seemed to tilt slightly, like I wasn't fully in my body anymore. Everyone at the table froze. My family immediately thought something was wrong with me. They asked if I was okay, if I felt sick, if I had food poisoning or was about to pass out. It took me a full minute to collect myself enough to speak. When I finally did, I told them why I reacted the way I did. I told them about that summer day in the 1980s, about sitting on the porch in the wicker swinging chair, about looking through the screen door and seeing a man sitting on the couch, about his black and red flannel shirt, his thick black hair, his beard, about how real he looked, about how I never told anyone because it didn't seem important at the time. The table went silent. From the look on my face, they believed me immediately. There was no laughter, no brushing it off. My uncle just stared at me, stunned. He admitted that he had never told anyone outside a small circle about what he used to see in that house either. What made it even stranger was this. Neither of us felt that the presence was bad. My uncle said he never felt threatened. The figure never scared him. It never did anything to bother anyone. It was just there, like a person going about their business, like someone who still considered that house home. I felt the same way, even as a child. When I saw the man on the couch, I wasn't afraid. I didn't feel watched or uneasy. He didn't give off anything dark or hostile. He was just there. That realization stuck with me more than anything else. I had seen him once, briefly, without knowing what I was seeing. My uncle had seen him many times out of the corner of his eye over the years. Decades later, our stories lined up perfectly without either of us knowing the other had experienced the same thing. I had carried that moment silently for years. So had he. To this day, when I think about that house, I don't think of fear. I think of time, of layers, of how some places hold on to echoes of the people who once lived there. Not everything that lingers is angry or dangerous. Some things just remain, quietly, as if they never quite realized they were supposed to leave. And every time I picture that living room, I still see him sitting there on the couch, calm and ordinary, like he'd always been part of the house, waiting for someone to notice him again. This happened a long time ago, back when I was still living in my home city. I grew up and lived in Karachi, Pakistan for most of my life, before eventually moving to the UK. Even though I've built a new life here, what happened that day has never really left me. It's not something you forget. It settles somewhere deep inside you and stays there. At the time, I lived in a fairly busy area of the city. Like most people, I knew my neighborhood well, or at least I thought I did. There was a large government building not too far from where we lived. Everyone around assumed it was just another ordinary office, some boring government department where paperwork got shuffled around all day. No one paid much attention to it. We walked past it, drove by it, lived our lives around it without ever thinking twice. What none of us knew was that the building was actually a CID office, the Criminal Investigation Department. Basically, it was Pakistan's version of the FBI. That fact only became clear after everything was already destroyed. The date was November 11th, 2010. That day had started like any other workday. Nothing unusual. I went to work, did my job, got tired like everyone else does. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted and just wanted to unwind. On my way home, I thought about going to the gym. The gym I used to go to wasn't far at all, maybe around 0.3 miles from my place. It had a sauna, and after a long day of work, the idea of sitting in the sauna sounded perfect. I decided to walk instead of taking any transport. It was close, and walking felt like a good way to clear my head. I got home, changed quickly into my gym clothes, and headed out. The weather was normal. The street looked normal. People were around, cars passing by, shops open. Nothing felt off. I hadn't even been walking for 10 minutes. I was probably about 0.1 miles away from the gym when it happened. For a fraction of a second, a nanosecond really, I felt something strange under my feet. It was like the ground itself shifted, like the earth trembled. Before my brain could even process that feeling, there was an explosion, not just a loud sound, the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. It wasn't like fireworks. It wasn't like thunder. It was something violent, deep and overwhelming. At the exact same moment as the sound, I felt a massive pressure hit my chest. The only way I can describe it is like being kicked straight in the chest with full force. Imagine someone as big as a professional wrestler, wearing heavy military boots and kicking you as hard as they possibly can. That's what it felt like. The force knocked the breath out of me instantly. My ears started screaming in pain. Within seconds, both of my ears began bleeding. I didn't even realize it at first. Everything was chaos. Sound was distorted like I was underwater. My body reacted before my mind could. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground. I had fallen. Without even realizing it, I was lying there, covering my ears with my hands because the pain was unbearable. Dirt and debris covered my clothes, my head was spinning, and I had no idea what had just happened. As I struggled to understand what was going on, I started noticing things around me. Every car alarm in the area was going off at the same time. The noise was overwhelming. Glass was everywhere. Windows had shattered, shop fronts were destroyed. Anything made of glass within a huge radius had broken. Later, I learned that the damage stretched across 1 to 2 miles. As I tried to stand up, I smelled something that I will never forget. It was a mix of gunpowder and something else, something much worse. It smelled like burning meat, like someone was having a barbecue, but twisted and wrong. That smell still haunts me. Even now, years later, if I catch a similar smell, my stomach turns. It's not something you can unsmell once it's burned into your memory. While I was still trying to get my balance, things started falling from the sky. At first, I thought it was dust and debris, and some of it was. But then I realized there were other things landing around me. Small pieces, wet pieces. I looked down and saw something on my arm that made my mind completely shut down for a moment. It was human skin. A piece of someone else's flesh had landed on me. I couldn't believe it. My brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I brushed my arm violently, trying to get it off, wiping my clothes, shaking myself like I could shake the reality away. My hands were trembling. My ears were still ringing, blood running down the side of my face. I forced myself to stand. People were screaming everywhere, crying, shouting names, calling for help. I followed the sound of the screams, moving closer to where the destruction was worst. As I walked, I noticed deep cracks in the walls of nearby buildings. Some cracks were 3 feet long, some 5 feet long. Entire sections of walls had collapsed from the shockwave. I stepped through a gap where a wall had been blown apart, and that's when I saw it. It looked like something straight out of a Hollywood war movie, except there was nothing cinematic about it. This was real, too real. Cars were on fire, thick black smoke filled the air. Bodies were scattered across the ground. Some were moving, crying out in pain. Others were completely still. By then, it was clear to me what had happened. It was a bomb blast. As I moved closer to the center of the explosion, I saw a massive crater in the ground. It was about 10 feet deep and nearly 30 feet wide. Water had already started filling it, and the building that used to stand there, the CID building, was simply gone, completely erased. There was nothing left but rubble, twisted metal, and fire. Hundreds of people were lying on the ground. Some were crying for help. Some were screaming in agony. Some were silent. People were missing. Limbs, legs were gone. Arms were gone. Some people didn't have their lower bodies anymore. I saw things that no human being should ever have to see. One image is burned into my mind. I saw a woman sitting on the ground, screaming and hitting herself over and over again. She was crying in a way that didn't sound human. Later, I realized why. Her husband was lying nearby. His legs were gone. Most of his torso was gone. There was nothing anyone could do for him. Another image that still haunts me is a young man, maybe 18 or 20 years old. He was lying on the ground, face down, but his neck was twisted in a way that his face was turned toward me. His eyes were open. He was staring straight at me. His feet were twisted the wrong way, completely backwards. Even now, I can see his face clearly. I don't know how long I stood there in shock. Time didn't feel real anymore. Eventually, police arrived. Ambulances, media, crowds started forming. At some point, I realized I needed to go home. I don't even remember how I got there. My body was on autopilot. That night changed everything. After that day, my life didn't immediately fall apart, but something inside me did. Every evening after dusk, I would see that young man again. The one who had died in the blast. I would see him standing in my house, staring at me. Sometimes he was in the doorway, sometimes in the hallway, always looking directly into my eyes. I would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced he was there. For 2 or 3 weeks straight, this happened almost every night. Midnight would come, and I would feel him there, watching me. I know some people would call it trauma. Maybe it was. But when you've seen what I saw, labels don't really matter. Even now, years later, I remember the sound of that blast. I remember the pressure hitting my chest. I remember the smell. I remember the faces. To this day, loud bangs still mess with me. Fireworks, sudden noises, even loud music dropping unexpectedly can make my heart jump. Sometimes I tell my wife that a loud noise reminded me of something bad I experienced. I don't go into detail. Inside my heart, though, I silently pray that God never puts anyone through something like that, not even in their worst nightmares, because there are some things you can survive, but they stay with you forever, and that day in Karachi is one of them. This happened about 5 years ago, during a strange and difficult period of my life. At the time, I was living with my grandmother. There's a long explanation behind why that was the case, but the short version is simple. I was 19 years old, taking 2 years off before starting university and working full-time. My parents lived about 45 minutes outside the city, and between rent prices and car insurance, living on my own just wasn't realistic. Staying with my grandmother made sense financially, and it also meant she wasn't alone. We lived in a small house just a few blocks away from an enormous shopping mall. When the mall was first built, the area around it was considered decent, busy, but safe enough. Over the years, though, things slowly changed. The neighborhood didn't suddenly become a war zone, but it definitely started to feel rougher. You could feel it in small ways. More sketchy people hanging around at night, more uncomfortable interactions, the kind of place where your instincts tell you to keep your head up and your keys in your hand when walking home. To give an example, one night a guy asked me for a cigarette while I was walking back from the store. I told him honestly that I didn't smoke and didn't have one. He immediately started shouting at me, calling me a liar, swearing, and accusing me of holding out on him. Then he tried to follow me home. I managed to lose him, but that kind of thing became common enough that it stopped feeling surprising. Still, none of that prepared me for what happened one particular night. That night, my grandmother and I were both getting ready for bed. It was late, quiet, and nothing felt out of the ordinary. My grandmother had dementia, although most people would never guess it. She was incredibly intelligent and very good at hiding it, especially around strangers. But there were moments where it showed, usually in strange habits or extreme paranoia. She had developed a routine of placing objects near the front door at night, partly for noise, partly for comfort. Removing all of that just to check the peephole was such a hassle that she preferred to look out the window instead. Just as we were about to turn in for the night, there was a knock at the front door. It wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to get our attention immediately. My first instinct was confusion. Nobody we knew would come by that late without calling first. My grandmother became anxious almost instantly. She shuffled toward the window and carefully moved the curtain aside to look outside. That's when everything changed. There was a woman crouched directly in front of our door. At first glance, she didn't look right. She wasn't just standing there waiting to be let in. She was crouched low, almost hiding, and in her hands she held something large and blunt. I couldn't tell exactly what it was in the dim light, but it looked similar to a baseball bat or a heavy metal bar. The way she was holding it made my stomach drop. Before I could react, she suddenly moved toward the window next to the door. My bedroom was right beside the front entrance, and there was a small window near ground level. It opened outward from the bottom using a crank, which meant it couldn't open very far. That window was now the only thing between us and her. She started trying to force her way in. She pushed her hands against the window, trying to pry it open wider than it could go. The glass rattled in its frame. I could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate, right outside. My grandmother was terrified, but dementia does strange things to fear. Instead of backing away, she started moving towards the door, mumbling that maybe the woman needed help. It took everything I had to stop her. For about 30 seconds, I was focused entirely on getting my grandmother away from the front of the house. I grabbed her gently but firmly and guided her across the hall to her bedroom. She kept resisting, trying to turn back, insisting we shouldn't leave someone outside in the cold. I managed to get her inside her room, told her to lock the door and stay there no matter what. Then I pulled out my phone and called the police. While the phone rang, the woman outside started whispering. Her voice was low and calm, which somehow made it even worse. She kept saying that she was cold, that she just wanted to come inside, that she needed a place to sleep, over and over again in the same soft tone. She never raised her voice. She never sounded angry. That made my skin crawl. Her hand slid further into the gap in the window, fingers scraping against the frame as she tried to force it open more. At that point, fear turned into pure survival instinct. I shouted at her. I told her to take her hand out of the window. When she didn't, I screamed that I would cut her hand off if she didn't pull it back. That finally worked. She slowly withdrew her hand and backed away from the window, but she didn't leave. For the next hour, she stayed outside our house. She walked around it slowly, trying every window. I could hear her footsteps crunching on gravel. Sometimes she'd stop and whisper again. Other times she'd just stand there silently. I kept the lights off and stayed as quiet as possible, listening to every sound. My grandmother, meanwhile, had called the police herself from her room. She kept forgetting she'd already done it and calling again. Somehow, despite multiple calls, the police never came. Not once. Eventually, the woman disappeared. I don't know when exactly. At some point, the sounds stopped, and the night went quiet again. I stayed awake until morning, sitting near my grandmother's door, listening, heart pounding at every creak of the house. Nothing like that ever happened again. But that night changed how I see safety. It showed me how thin the line really is between normal life and absolute terror. Even now, years later, I still think about that woman crouched at the door, whispering in the dark, holding that weapon. And the part that unsettles me the most isn't just that she came, it's that no one ever came to help. This happened back in 2005, when I was still living with my parents in Florida. It was during Hurricane Wilma, one of those storms that completely shut everything down and made time feel strange and stretched out. I was younger then, still living at home, and that week is burned into my memory in a way I didn't fully understand until much later. When Wilma hit, it knocked out electricity for a huge portion of the state. Our neighborhood lost power almost immediately, and it didn't come back for about a week and a half. At that time, we didn't own a generator. We were completely in the dark once the sun went down, relying on candles, flashlights, and a battery-powered radio for news and updates. Nights were especially unsettling. Florida nights are already loud with insects, but without electricity, without streetlights, without the normal hum of life, everything felt more exposed. One of our neighbors, the family who lived directly behind us, did have a generator. Their backyard faced ours, separated by a fence, and at night, their house stood out in an eerie way. Every other house around us was completely dark, but theirs glowed. Lights on, a working stove, fans running. It felt strange seeing that single pocket of light in an otherwise black neighborhood. On the second night, without power, my dad was outside talking to the man from that house over the fence. I remember watching them from our back door, listening to the generator hum in the distance. The neighbor was friendly, like always. He and his wife were genuinely kind people. They had 2 young daughters around 5 and 7 years old. They were the kind of family that made you feel comfortable right away. They invited my parents and me over for dinner since they could actually cook. It felt like a small blessing in the middle of the chaos. We went over while there was still some light left in the sky. I remember sitting at their table, eating a hot meal, talking about the storm, laughing, a little, trying to feel normal. Their daughters were full of energy despite everything, running around, playing, asking questions. It all felt safe, familiar, human. There was a curfew in place because of the hurricane aftermath, so shortly after dark, we said our goodbyes and walked back to our house. The contrast was immediate, from their lit home back into darkness. Our house felt quiet and hollow without power, but that was normal by then. We settled into the den, lit a few candles, and listened to hurricane updates on the radio. It was just another strange night in a long string of them. About 2 hours later, something changed. We were sitting there talking about nothing important when my dad suddenly went quiet. He walked over to the window that looked out into our backyard. I remember the way his posture shifted. He leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. He said he saw someone in the neighbor's backyard. At first, none of us panicked. We assumed it was the neighbor himself, maybe checking something near the fence or generator. Still, my dad thought it was odd enough to call them just to be sure. He picked up his cell phone and called the neighbor's wife. She answered. My dad casually asked if her husband had lost something in the backyard. He told her he could see a man back there and that he had several flashlights if help was needed. There was a pause. Then she made this startled sound. Not a scream, but a sharp intake of breath, like sudden fear. Over the phone, I could hear her call out to her husband. Almost immediately, there was a man's voice in the background, tense and alarmed. Everything escalated very fast after that. What we learned later chilled me to my core. Shortly after my dad made that call, the neighbors ran to the back of their house. Toward the daughter's bedroom, the girls were inside, getting ready for bed. When the parents reached the room, they saw a man standing outside the window looking in. When he realized he had been noticed, he ran. But not before they clearly saw him. His pants were partially down. That detail has never left me. The man disappeared into the darkness, and the neighbors immediately called the police. Officers eventually came out, but in the chaos after a hurricane, with curfews and power outages, nothing happened quickly. The man was reported, and it was later discovered that he wasn't a stranger passing through. He lived 2 or 3 houses down from us. That realization hit me harder than anything else. All through grade school and middle school, I had walked home from the bus stop every afternoon past his house. He was almost always outside, sitting on his porch, working in his yard, watching the street. He always smiled, always said hi. He was one of those adults you barely register as a kid, just part of the neighborhood scenery. Knowing that he had been standing outside a little girl's bedroom window in the dark during a blackout made me feel sick. Even worse was what came after. When I was younger, I used to sleep with my bedroom curtain open. I liked the feeling of openness, of seeing the sky, the trees, the moonlight. It never felt dangerous. That night, and every night after learning what happened, that memory turned sour. I couldn't stop thinking about how exposed I had been, how easily someone could have been watching without me ever knowing. The thought made my stomach turn. Nothing else ever happened with him, at least nothing that we heard about. But the damage was already done. That single night rewired something in my brain. It taught me that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it lives just a few houses away. Sometimes it smiles and waves and blends into your everyday life. Even now, years later, that memory makes me uneasy. I think about the hurricane, the darkness, the generator humming in the distance, the way my dad just happened to look out the window at the right moment. I think about how close it all came to something even worse. And I think about how many things we never see, simply because we don't think to look. I still have a hard time thinking about this even now. Some memories don't fade with time. They don't soften or blur around the edges. They stay sharp, clear, and heavy, no matter how many years pass. This is one of those memories for me. I had a friend who was genuinely one of the kindest people I've ever known. She was the kind of person who made you feel seen just by being around her. She smiled easily, laughed often, and had this warmth about her that felt natural, not forced. Loving came effortlessly to her. She loved everyone, without conditions, without judgment. I've met very few people like that in my life. For the sake of this story, I'll call her Rachel. Rachel was beautiful in that way that had nothing to do with makeup or clothes. It was in how she spoke to people, how she listened, how she cared. I had a crush on her for a long time. It was obvious to me, but I never pushed it. We texted a lot. We talked on the phone sometimes. Long conversations about nothing important and everything important at the same time. But that part of the story isn't what matters most. What matters is who she was. Rachel's mom owned a small shop in the same strip of businesses where I worked, literally right next door to the shop I was at. Because of that, Rachel and her mom were always around. They would stop in just to say hi, chat for a few minutes, joke around with me and my coworkers. It felt casual, familiar, like a small community inside that strip mall. Rachel's mom was kind too. You could tell where Rachel got it from. They were close, always laughing together, always comfortable in each other's presence. Seeing them together made you feel like some families really do get it right. Rachel also had a younger brother. I'll call him Tony. Tony was much younger than Rachel. She was around 20 years old at the time, and Tony was about 13. Despite his age, he was incredibly intelligent, not in a show-off way, not loud or arrogant. He was quiet, thoughtful, soft-spoken, the kind of kid who listened more than he talked. At one point, Tony even interned briefly at the shop where I worked. He helped out with small tasks, learned quickly, and honestly impressed everyone. He was polite, respectful, and serious for his age. No one ever felt uncomfortable around him. If anything, people commented on how mature he seemed. Looking back, that's part of what makes this so hard to process. Nothing felt wrong. There were no warning signs that any of us recognized. No red flags waving in the air. No obvious cracks in the picture. Rachel adored her brother. She talked about him with pride. Tony seemed calm, composed, and normal. Their family seemed stable, loving, safe. Then one night, everything ended. I found out not long after it happened. The news hit me like a physical blow. Rachel was at home. It was night. She was downstairs sitting on the couch, watching TV. Just a normal evening, the kind of moment you don't think twice about, the kind of moment you assume will just pass quietly into the next day. Tony came downstairs. He was holding a pistol. Without warning, without an argument, without anything that made sense, he shot Rachel multiple times. She didn't survive. After shooting his sister, Tony started walking back upstairs. His intention was clear later. He was going upstairs to kill his parents too, somehow in what feels like a cruel mix of luck and horror. His father managed to stop him. His dad wrestled the gun away before Tony could shoot either of them. If he hadn't, that entire family would have been wiped out in minutes. When police arrived, when everything started to come apart in the open, Tony didn't have an explanation. He said he didn't know why he did it. Witnesses later described his expression as blank, emotionless. He wasn't crying, he wasn't screaming, he wasn't panicking, he wasn't apologetic. It was like something inside him was simply gone, or never there to begin with. Now imagine being those parents. In a matter of moments, they lost their daughter, a daughter who was loving, kind, and full of life. And at the same time, they lost their son in a different way, because their son was now facing trial for murder. Their child had killed their other child. There is no way to prepare for that kind of reality. No handbook, no words that make it make sense. For me, it felt unreal. One day, Rachel was alive. She was texting, laughing, stopping by the shop, talking about her day. The next day, she was gone, not sick, not in an accident, not slowly, gone violently, suddenly at the hands of someone who was supposed to love her unconditionally. I remember staring at my phone after I heard the news, scrolling through old messages, rereading conversations, like they might somehow change if I read them again. I remember thinking about the last time I saw her smile, the last joke she made, the last time she said goodbye like it was just another day. It messed with my sense of reality in a way I wasn't prepared for. There's something especially disturbing about violence that comes from inside a home, from inside a family, from someone you would never suspect. It shatters the idea that you can always tell who is dangerous and who isn't. Tony was 13, a kid who had worked alongside us, a kid who spoke softly, a kid who seemed intelligent, calm, and harmless. Reconciling that image with what he did feels impossible. Even now, my brain struggles to place those two versions of him into the same person. And Rachel, She didn't deserve any of it. She deserved the life she was building, the love she gave so freely, the future she talked about so casually, assuming it would come because why wouldn't it? She was good, she was kind, she was loved. Her death left a hole that never really closed, not just for her family, but for everyone who knew her. The strip of shops felt different after that. Quieter, heavier. Every time I walked past her mom's store, it felt wrong, like the world had kept moving when it shouldn't have. I still think about her parents sometimes. I can't imagine the weight they carry, grieving one child while watching another be processed through the justice system, loving him because he's their son, while living with what he did. That kind of pain doesn't have an ending, it just changes shape. As for me, the experience changed how I look at people, not in a cynical way, but in a cautious, sobered way. It reminded me that you never fully know what's happening inside someone's mind. That even love, even family, even familiarity doesn't always mean safety. It also reminded me how fragile life really is. Rachel was here and then she wasn't. No warning, no reason that made sense. Just absence. And that's the part that breaks my heart the most. Not just that she died, but how suddenly she was erased from the everyday world. One moment she was part of my life, part of so many people's lives, and the next she existed only in memories, stories, and the ache of missing her. She was an incredible person. She is missed, and she always will be. I used to be a regular at a small convenience store right near my house. It was one of those places you end up going to without even thinking about it. I went there every single day, sometimes more than once a day, usually just to grab a fountain drink, a snack, or something small. The employees started recognizing me, and eventually it felt familiar, almost routine, like part of my day. One of the cashiers there was a woman around my age. At first, our conversations were just small talk. How's your day going? Weather complaints, work stress, normal stuff. But over time, those short chats turned into longer conversations. We started talking about our lives. She knew I was married, and she would always smile and comment on how cute my husband and I were together whenever he came in with me. She seemed genuinely happy for us, and I liked that about her. She had this warm, bubbly energy that made it easy to talk to her. After a couple of weeks, she started opening up about her own life. She told me she had 2 young kids, a boy and a girl, ages 5 and 6. She talked about how hard it was being a single mom, working long hours, trying to balance everything. Then one day, she told me she had started seeing someone new. At first, it sounded like a typical new relationship. She talked about how exciting it felt to finally have someone in her life again, how lonely she had been before. As the days went by, her stories about him became more frequent. She would light up when she talked about him, smiling so wide it felt contagious. She told me he was amazing, that he treated her so well, that he adored her kids. Things moved very fast between them. Within just a few months, he had already moved in with her. She didn't talk about it like it was risky or sudden. To her, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She said he stepped right into a fatherly role with her children. She talked about how good he was with them, how he played with them, helped with routines, acted like a real dad. Every time I came in, she had something new to say about him. She would gush about how lucky she felt, how she finally found a real partner. She talked about their future together, about how they wanted to have a child of their own soon. She sounded hopeful, excited, like someone who truly believed she had found happiness after a hard stretch of life. I remember thinking that she seemed so genuinely in love. She laughed a lot. She joked. She seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. I never had any reason to doubt her happiness, and I was honestly glad for her. Then one night, everything felt wrong. I went into the store like I always did, late in the evening, just to grab my usual fountain drink. When I walked up to the counter, I immediately noticed something was off. She was there, but she wasn't the same person I'd been talking to every day. She didn't smile, she didn't greet me, she wouldn't even look me in. The eyes. Her body language was closed off, stiff. Her face looked empty, like she was somewhere else entirely. I tried to say hello, tried to make small talk, but she barely responded. She rang me up silently, handed me my receipt, and turned away. It was shocking, honestly. This was someone who normally chatted with me non-stop. Someone who always seemed happy to see familiar faces. That night, she looked cold and distant, like she was barely holding herself together. I told myself she was probably just exhausted or having a bad day. Everyone has them. I didn't want to pry or make assumptions, so I left it alone. The next night, I went back to the store and she wasn't there. The night after that, she still wasn't there. That's when I started feeling uneasy. A few days later, I learned what had actually happened. And once I knew, I couldn't stop replaying every interaction I'd had with her in my head. That night, I last saw her before she became distant and silent. Something horrific had happened at her home. Earlier that evening, while she was getting ready for work, her youngest daughter, the 5-year-old, had been giving her boyfriend some attitude. Just normal kid behavior, nothing extreme. According to the reports later, the boyfriend reacted with violence. He beat the little girl, not just a slap or a shove. He beat her until she was unconscious. When she stopped responding, he laid her on the couch. And then, as if nothing had happened, the two adults sat down and had a quiet dinner together while the child lay there, lifeless, on the couch. At around 10 o'clock that night, the mother left for work. She left her unconscious daughter behind. By midnight, while she was at work, her phone started blowing up. Her boyfriend was calling and texting her, saying he couldn't wake the child, that something was wrong, that she needed to come home and deal with it. That was around the time I walked into the store and tried to say hi to her. Now, knowing what I know, it makes sense why she looked the way she did. She wasn't tired. She wasn't having a normal bad day. She was in shock. She was disconnected from reality, going through the motions while something unimaginable was happening in her life. She left work shortly after that. When she got home, her daughter was still unconscious. Instead of calling emergency services right away, they tried to wake her themselves. They put her in the bath, hoping that water might bring her around. It didn't work. Hours passed. Finally, around 3 in the morning, they called the police. The little girl was taken to the hospital, but it was too late. She died that night. What makes this even harder to process is what came out afterward. During the investigation, it was revealed that the mother defended her boyfriend the entire time. Even after her child was dead, she stood by him. She claimed he didn't mean it. She minimized what had happened. She protected him instead of her daughter. The autopsy revealed the truth. This wasn't a one-time incident. The little girl's body showed bruises and cuts at different stages of healing. That meant she had been beaten repeatedly over a long period of time. There were injuries that were days old, weeks old, evidence of ongoing abuse. Even worse, there were bite marks on her body, including on her buttocks. When I found this out, I felt physically sick. I thought about all the times this woman had stood behind the counter, smiling, laughing, talking about how wonderful her boyfriend was. I thought about how she described him as an amazing father figure, how she trusted him with her children, how she dreamed about having another baby with him. And all that time, her daughter was being abused in her own home. I kept thinking about the way she looked the last night I saw her, the emptiness in her eyes, the way she seemed detached from everything around her. I wondered if part of her already knew what had happened, or if she was still in denial, pushing reality away because it was too much to face. I also thought about how easy it is to miss signs from the outside. From my perspective, she looked like a happy woman who had finally found love. I never saw fear, I never saw bruises, I never saw her kids. I had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. That realization haunted me. I had considered her a friend. Not a close friend, but someone I cared about. Someone I talked to almost every day. And yet, there was this entire hidden reality I knew nothing about. I stopped going to that store after that. I couldn't walk in there without thinking about her daughter, about what had happened. Even now, years later, the memory still makes my chest feel tight. What stays with me the most is how normal everything seemed right up until it wasn't. How love, or what looked like love, was used to excuse unimaginable cruelty. How someone could choose a partner over their own child. And how a smiling face behind a counter can hide something so dark that you never see it coming until it's far too late. It's one of those stories that changes the way you see people forever. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams. When I was a child, my next-door neighbor was my best friend in the world. We were born just 3 weeks apart, so close in age that our families liked to joke that we grew up together from the very beginning. In fact, she was technically the first friend I ever met in my life. Our parents introduced us when I was literally a newborn, and from that moment on, we were almost inseparable. My younger sister, my neighbor, and I spent most of our childhood playing together outside. Our houses shared a fence, and for years that fence was just part of the background of our lives. We would talk over it, pass toys over it, and most often play volleyball over it. Someone would toss the ball up, it would sail over the fence, and the other side would scramble to hit it back. We did this for hours at a time, laughing, arguing over points, making up rules as we went. Eventually, my father decided to remove the fence completely. It was old, weathered, and full of splinters. He worried one of us would get hurt leaning against it or climbing on it. One day it was just gone. Where the fence had been was now open space. Our 2 yards blended into one, and in our minds, that just made playtime better. There was more room to run, more freedom, and nothing blocking our view of each other. On the day this happened, we were all about 9 years old. It was a normal day, sunny and quiet, the kind of day where parents felt comfortable letting kids play outside without hovering nearby. There were no adults visibly watching us, no fences separating us from the street anymore. Just 3 kids playing volleyball in the open yard, laughing and focused on the game. At some point while we were playing, I noticed a car. It was a tan sedan, nothing flashy, nothing that would normally stand out. At first I didn't think much of it. Cars drove through the neighborhood all the time. But then I noticed it again and again. Our neighborhood was made up entirely of one-way streets. That meant you couldn't accidentally circle the same block multiple times unless you were doing it on purpose. This car drove past our houses once, then disappeared. A few minutes later, it came back. Slower this time, then it did it again. By the 3rd time, my stomach started to feel strange. The car slowed down noticeably in front of our houses. I could see the brake lights come on. As it passed us, I saw the driver lean far over into the empty passenger seat, twisting his body to stare directly at us. Not a casual glance, not curiosity, a long, focused stare. Then he sped off again. It was so obvious that even a 9-year-old could tell something wasn't right. I stopped playing. I didn't fully understand why I felt uneasy, but I knew I needed to tell my mom. I went inside the house and found her in the kitchen. I told her what I had seen, trying to explain it as clearly as I could. The circling car, the slowing down, the way the man leaned over and stared at us. She didn't panic. She didn't dismiss me either. She thanked me for telling her. She told me I could go back outside and keep playing. To my child brain, that felt reassuring, like maybe it really was nothing. But she didn't just ignore it. Instead of staying in the kitchen, she moved into the living room. From there, we had a large picture window that looked directly out over the yard and the street. She sat down where she could see us clearly. That decision may have saved my best friend's life. Not long after I went back outside, the tan sedan came back again. This time, it didn't just slow down, it stopped. The man parked his car in the road, not in a driveway, not pulled over neatly, but right there in front of our houses. He left the passenger door open and got out. Slowly, casually, like he belonged there, he walked toward us. I remember how quiet everything suddenly felt. The ball dropped to the ground. My best friend was closest to him. He stopped a short distance away from her and mumbled something. It sounded like a question, maybe asking for directions. He spoke quietly, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. She couldn't understand him. She leaned forward slightly and took a step closer, trying to hear what he was saying. He took a step closer too. He spoke again, a little louder, but still unclear. That's when my mother saw everything. She didn't hesitate. She burst out of the front door, screaming at the top of her lungs. She ran straight toward him, shouting at him to get the fuck back in his car and get the fuck out of our neighborhood. Her voice was full of rage and fear. There was no politeness, no confusion, no hesitation. She physically placed herself between us and him. The man froze for a second, clearly shocked that an adult had appeared so suddenly. Then he turned and hurried back toward his car. My mom followed him, still yelling, still chasing him up the road, all while dialing 911 on her phone. He got into his car and sped away. My mom didn't stop until she was sure he was gone. Then she came back to us, shaking but focused, pulling us close and bringing us inside. Later, we learned the truth. The man was a registered child sex offender. Not only that, but he had also been circling the neighborhood, watching a completely different group of children as well. We weren't the only ones he had his eye on that day. Knowing that fact changed everything. When I think back on it now as an adult, the small details haunt me. How close he stood, how calm he seemed, how easily my friend stepped closer because she was just a kid who assumed adults were safe. How one moment of silence or delay could have led to something horrific. If my mom hadn't moved to that living room window, if she hadn't trusted her instincts, if she hadn't reacted as aggressively and loudly as she did, things could have ended very differently. For years afterward, that memory stayed with me. It changed how I understood danger. It taught me that bad people don't always look scary. They don't always grab or run or shout. Sometimes they circle quietly. Sometimes they pretend to need help. Sometimes they wait for just the right moment when no adults are watching. It also taught me something else, that telling an adult when something feels wrong matters. I was just a kid. I didn't have proof. I didn't have words like predator or registered offender. I just had a feeling that something was off. And because I spoke up, because my mom listened, someone was there to stop it. Even now, thinking about it makes my chest feel tight. Because that day could have been the day my best friend disappeared. And instead, it became the day we learned how close danger can come without you even realizing it. This happened a long time ago, back when I was young, arrogant, and convinced that I was far more capable than I actually was. At the time, I was serving as a missionary in Brazil. Looking back on it now, I can say without hesitation that I was dumb as hell in the way only young people with a sense of purpose and very little life experience can be. My companion and I spent most of our days walking long distances in the heat, knocking on doors, talking to strangers, and trying to convince people to listen to what we were selling. We were idealistic, stubborn, and honestly pretty naive. We believed that good intentions and faith were enough to protect us from anything truly dangerous. That belief was very wrong. One day, while we were walking along a roadside, we were approached by a man who at first glance looked homeless. His clothes were dirty and worn, his beard was long and unkempt, and his overall appearance suggested someone who had been living rough for a very long time. But when he spoke, everything about the interaction immediately shifted. He greeted us in almost perfect English. Not broken English, not heavily accented, almost perfect, casual American English. That alone was surprising enough to stop us in our tracks. Americans were rare in that area, especially ones who looked like him. As we talked, we learned that he was indeed American. He told us his name was Bickford, and that he had been living in Brazil for around 30 years. He was somewhere in his late 50s or early 60s, though it was hard to tell exactly because his appearance made him look older than he probably was. He seemed genuinely excited to talk to us, not because of religion, but because we were Americans. It was obvious that speaking English again thrilled him. He asked questions about where we were from, what it was like back home, and what brought us to Brazil. He feigned interest in what we were preaching and even asked for a copy of the Book of Mormon. At the time, that felt like a win. We met with him a few more times after that. Each time the meetings were strange in subtle ways. He never invited us into a normal home or public building. Instead, he always wanted to meet on the side of the road, near some trees, or in public places that were technically open but still isolated. Places where there were no people nearby and no clear reason to linger. Still, nothing he did crossed a line clearly enough for us to justify walking away. There was just this constant low-level unease that we couldn't quite explain. As missionaries, we were required to give weekly reports to the local ecclesiastical leader about who we were meeting with and teaching. During one of these meetings, we mentioned Bickford. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. The bishop and his counselors all knew exactly who we were talking about. They warned us very clearly to stay away from him. They told us that he was unstable, that he had a history of bothering missionaries, and that once or twice a year he would resurface and start seeking them out. They said this wasn't new behavior. My companion and I were shocked. We couldn't reconcile the warnings with the man we thought we knew. Yes, he was odd. Yes, he was creepy in an intangible way. But dangerous, that seemed like an exaggeration to us, so we ignored the advice. That decision still haunts me. We continued meeting with him. The more time we spent with him, the worse the feeling became. There were inconsistencies in his stories, flat-out lies that he didn't even seem to care about keeping straight. His demeanor would shift unpredictably. Sometimes he was charming and friendly. Other times he felt cold, distant, and wrong. There was something deeply unsettling about him that went beyond his appearance. It was in the way he watched us, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long, the way he would coincidentally appear near our house, claiming he just happened to be passing by. At some point, he started talking about his home in the jungle. He described it as peaceful, beautiful, a place of quiet reflection. He spoke about nature like it was a sanctuary. Eventually, he suggested that we come visit him there so we could talk more privately. Every instinct I had told me this was a bad idea. But again, we had nothing concrete, no single action we could point to and say, this is where it becomes dangerous. And as missionaries, we were trained to push through discomfort, to see fear as weakness, to believe that faith would protect us. So we agreed. We arranged to meet him at the side of the road, in front of the path that led to his house. When the time came, my companion and I stood there waiting. Minutes passed, then more. Bickford was late, very late. We were just about to leave when he finally appeared. He greeted us casually, like nothing was wrong, and immediately led us off the road and down a narrow path into the jungle. It was already very dark. This part of Brazil wasn't untouched wilderness, but it bordered a large reservoir, and once you stepped off the main roads, everything became isolated and overgrown very quickly. The path was barely visible. Foliage reached up to our waists. The sounds of insects and animals surrounded us. As we walked, I kept running face first into spider webs. This might sound trivial, but if you've never been in Brazil, you can't understand what that means. The spiders there are enormous, intelligent-looking, aggressive. Every time I felt a web brush across my face, my body went into full panic mode. I hated spiders with a passion, and these were the stuff of nightmares. I carried a small LED flashlight, but it barely cut through the darkness. The jungle swallowed the light. Everything beyond a few feet felt alive and watching. The walk seemed to go on forever. Finally, we reached a clearing. In the center of it stood what Bickford called his house. It was a wooden cabin that had partially collapsed in on itself. Parts of the roof had caved in. The walls leaned at odd angles. It looked abandoned, rotting, barely standing. Bickford smiled and said, "Welcome home." He led us inside. There was no door, no electricity, no running water, no utilities of any kind. As soon as we stepped inside, we realized that every piece of furniture had been deliberately destroyed. Not worn down, not broken by time. Destroyed. Chairs smashed into splinters, tables reduced to fragments, trash everywhere, rotting food on the stove. The smell was overwhelming, and then I noticed the walls. Every square inch of the wooden walls was covered in writing, chalk writing. It went up the walls, across the ceiling, everywhere. Tiny, frantic scrawlings layered over each other. When I trained my flashlight on them and started to read, my blood ran cold. Most of the messages were variations of the same themes. Jesus will forgive me, but I have to stop. I did it. Again. I can't do this anymore. Each of these phrases was accompanied by dates, month and day, over and over again. Then I saw the worst ones, names, children's names, ages, and graphic sexual descriptions written beside them. I felt like I was going to pass out. My companion and I did everything we could not to react. We didn't mention the writing. We didn't look at Bickford directly. We asked meaningless small talk questions about anything else we could think of. The food, the layout, the animals. He mentioned casually that he kept rats in the basement. A lot of rats. Around 100. At that point, my mind was screaming. I was in full panic, but I forced myself to stay calm on the outside. I could see from the way my companion avoided my eyes that he was just as terrified. We both knew we needed to leave immediately. We made an excuse about it getting late and said we needed to head home. Bickford seemed disappointed, but agreed to walk us back. He insisted that we come visit again. As we stepped back outside, he suddenly said he knew a shortcut. He pointed in a direction that clearly led deeper into the jungle, not back toward the road. We politely declined and said we preferred to take the way we came. For a moment, there was tension. Then he relented. We followed the trail we had made through the foliage. This time I did not care about the spiders. Fear had overridden everything else. When we finally stepped back onto the road and realized we were safe, we just stood there, staring at each other. Neither of us spoke at first. It was like we needed confirmation that the other had seen the same things. Once we started talking, I realized I couldn't speak properly. My throat locked up. I physically could not make sound. I had never been that scared in my life. My companion called our leaders immediately. They escalated it up the chain. Within a week, we were moved to a different area. Before we left, we made a detailed entry in the area book, warning all future missionaries to stay away from Bickford. I know how this story sounds, Every part of it feels like a cliché horror setup. The creepy man, the jungle, the cabin, the writing on the walls. That's exactly why, after our second meeting with him, I started recording every interaction. I had a small digital camera. I would set it to audio record and keep it in my pocket whenever we met him, because on some level I knew something wasn't right, and I wanted proof in case we didn't make it back. My brother used to work at a scrapyard for a man who had lived a very different life before that job. Before he ran the yard, his boss had spent years driving a tow truck, mostly overnight shifts, the kind of work most people don't want. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Dave. Dave had been an overnight tow truck driver for about 10 years. He worked the hours when the roads were quiet, when accidents were more likely to be serious, and when help often arrived late. Because of the nature of his job, he was frequently the first person on the scene when something went wrong. Sometimes emergency services hadn't even been called yet. He'd arrive alone, headlights cutting through darkness to twisted metal and silence. Dave wasn't squeamish. Over the years, he had seen things most people only encounter in movies or nightmares. He had seen dead bodies. He had seen people badly injured, bleeding, screaming, or shockingly calm despite what had happened to them. He had learned to shut parts of his mind down just to keep functioning. For nearly a decade, none of it had broken him. He carried an iron stomach and a tough exterior, and he believed he could handle anything the road threw at him. Until one night in the summer of 2005. That week had been especially wet. Heavy rain had soaked the roads day after day, leaving patches of standing water everywhere. Late one Sunday night, or rather very early Sunday morning, around 3 o'clock, Dave was driving toward a call. The roads were mostly empty, the world quiet except for rain and the hum of his engine. As he drove, a Corvette came flying up behind him. Even in the dark, Dave could tell the driver was going way too fast for the conditions. The car sat low to the ground, sleek and powerful, but completely unsuited for wet roads at high speed. Dave watched in his mirrors as the Corvette moved into the other lane, attempting to pass his tow truck. The problem was the corner. Just ahead was a sharp, blind turn. Dave knew the road well. He had driven it hundreds of times. You couldn't see around that bend until you were already in it. Passing there was a terrible idea, especially in the rain. Dave didn't have time to react before it happened. The Corvette hit a patch of water and instantly lost traction. Dave watched as the car hydroplaned, sliding uncontrollably. The driver tried to correct, overcorrected, and the car veered off the road. It left the pavement at speed and slammed into a streetlight. The impact was violent. The force of the crash wrapped the car around the pole, metal folding in on itself like paper. The windshield shattered and the driver was launched forward through it. Dave saw the body fly out of the car and land roughly 20 feet away, skidding across the wet ground. Dave pulled over immediately. Training and instinct kicked in before fear or shock could catch up. He grabbed his flashlight, jumped out of his truck, and ran toward the driver. He had no idea if the guy was alive or dead, but he had to check. As Dave got closer, he could see that the driver was a young man, maybe 20 or 21 years old. Somehow, unbelievably, the kid was still alive. He was conscious, on his hands and knees, breathing hard. Rain soaked his clothes. Broken glass glittered around him. Dave called out to him, telling him not to move. He yelled that help was on the way, that he needed to stay still. The kid didn't respond. He seemed focused on something else entirely. As Dave approached from behind, he noticed the young man was scraping at the ground beneath him with his hands. Digging, almost. At first, Dave thought the kid was confused, maybe trying to crawl. Maybe in shock and not aware of his injuries. Dave kept shouting, telling him to stop moving, telling him he could be badly hurt and not know it yet. Then Dave got close enough to see the truth. The kid hadn't just been thrown through the windshield. He had been disemboweled. When the young man went through the glass, the sharp edges had torn his abdomen open. His stomach and intestines were exposed. In his shock-addled state, his brain hadn't fully grasped what had happened. He was trying to fix it, trying to scoop his organs back into his body with his bare hands, as if that might somehow undo the damage. Dave froze. In all his years on the job, he had never seen anything like that. Not just the injury, but the awareness, the desperation, the horrible, instinctive attempt to survive in a way that no human should ever have to experience. The kid looked up briefly, eyes wide but unfocused. There was fear there, but also confusion, like his mind couldn't reconcile what his body was telling him. Blood pooled beneath him, dark against the wet asphalt. Dave knew immediately there was nothing he could do. He stayed with the kid, talking to him, trying to keep him calm, trying to keep him conscious. But the bleeding was massive, too much, too fast. The young man bled out before emergency services arrived. Even if they had gotten there sooner, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. The road was quiet again once it was over. Rain continued to fall. Red and blue lights eventually cut through the darkness. Dave stood off to the side, soaked, shaking, staring at the scene like he was watching someone else's nightmare. That was the night Dave quit. He didn't finish his shift. He didn't come back the next day. He walked away from towing entirely and never looked back. No amount of money, no sense of duty, no toughness could make him face something like that again. Years later, when my brother worked for him at the scrapyard, Dave would sometimes talk about his time as a tow truck driver. He didn't glorify it. He didn't joke about it. When that crash came up, his voice would change. He would stare off into space, reliving it. He still has nightmares. He dreams about wet roads and headlights in the dark. He dreams about scraping sounds and hands moving where they shouldn't. He wakes up sweating, heart racing, stuck in that moment when he realized what he was seeing and couldn't unsee it. That story stuck with my brother, and it stuck with me too when I heard it. It's a reminder of how fragile life really is, how quickly a single bad decision can end everything, and how some images never leave the people who witness them. Dave had seen death before, but that night showed him something far worse than death itself. It showed him a person realizing too late that their body was already beyond saving. My father was a hunter. That was a big part of who he was. He was also a mason, a businessman, and a man who believed deeply in discipline, responsibility, and tradition. Growing up, I listened to every lesson he taught me. Some of them were spoken directly, like advice about work, honesty, and doing the right thing. Others were unspoken, passed down through the way he lived his life and what he expected from me. Hunting was one of those things. To him, hunting wasn't just a hobby. It was a way to teach patience, focus, respect for nature, and self-reliance. To me, though, it was complicated. I never loved it. I didn't hate my dad, and I didn't want to disappoint him, so I never told him how I really felt. I went along with it because I thought that was what a good son was supposed to do. He always told me that hunting was a reward. If my grades weren't good, we didn't go. If I didn't behave, we didn't go. Hunting days were usually planned carefully around school and work. They were never spontaneous, and they were never on school days. That's why the day he told me we were going hunting on a Wednesday didn't make sense. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said it. I remember the tone of his voice, calm, steady, but different. Something about it made my chest feel tight. I didn't argue. I didn't question him out loud. But inside, Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. That night, I barely slept. The morning came early. It was still dark when we got into the car. The air was cold, the kind of cold that settles into your bones. As we drove, I stared out the window, watching the darkness slide past us. I had this heavy feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. It wasn't fear exactly, more like dread mixed with confusion. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. Why are we going hunting on a school day? Why did Dad kiss Mom goodbye like that? Why does everything feel different? When we left the house that morning, my dad hugged my mother longer than usual. He kissed her like it mattered more than normal. At the time, I noticed it, but I didn't understand it. Now, looking back, that moment burns in my memory. Another thing stood out to me as we drove. My dad wasn't wearing his Mason ring. He never took that ring off, ever. It was part of him. Seeing his hand without it felt wrong, like seeing someone without their shadow. I noticed it immediately and my heart sank a little deeper. I didn't say anything. I was 12 years old. I didn't have the words to describe what I was feeling. I just knew that something wasn't right, and that knowing scared me more than anything else. When we arrived at the hunting area, my dad told me that we had the whole place to ourselves. He said he had rented an acre of land so no one else would be around. That was unusual too. Normally we hunted public land or places where other hunters might be nearby. We got out of the car, gathered our gear, and started walking toward the spot where we had hunted before. It was still dark, and the ground was cold and wet. The water we had to cross had a thin layer of ice over it. I stayed close behind my dad, letting him break the ice with his steps so I wouldn't slip or fall in. I trusted him completely. We walked in silence, the only sounds being our boots, the water, and our breathing. The world felt very big and very empty. Eventually we came to a levee. By then the sky was starting to lighten. The sun was just beginning to rise, and I could see birds moving in the distance. My dad realized we were too late to make it to the blind. The ducks were already flying, lifting from their hiding places as daylight spread across the sky. He raised his shotgun and started shooting quickly, trying to make the most of the moment. Birds scattered everywhere. It was loud and chaotic after all that quiet. He hit one. I remember him turning to me and telling me to go get it. I nodded and started to turn back toward the water. My foot hadn't even fully stepped down when I heard another gunshot. This one was different. I turned around instantly. My dad was running. He had dropped his shotgun. He was clutching his coat to his chest with both hands. His face was pale and his eyes were wide. I ran toward him as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I asked him what happened. He told me he had been shot. Then he collapsed. I dropped down next to him, trying to talk to him, trying to understand what was happening. He couldn't speak. He was breathing, but barely. Each breath looked like it took everything he had. I was 12 years old. I had no idea what to do. My mind went blank, then filled with panic. I stood up and started running. I don't even remember deciding to do it. My body just moved. I ran and ran, calling out, crying, tripping, getting back up. The cold burned my lungs. My legs felt like they were on fire. I must have run for an hour. Eventually, I found someone. I don't remember exactly how. I just remember grabbing a man's hand and pulling him, trying to explain through gasps and tears that my dad was hurt. The man followed me and we ran back the way I thought we had come. Then I realized something terrifying. I was lost. The woods all looked the same. The water, the levee, the trees. I couldn't find the spot where I had left my dad. I started yelling, screaming his name, my voice cracking and breaking. The man told me to keep running in one direction while he went another way. He told me to yell if I found my dad. I took off again. I don't remember much after that. I ran until my body gave up. I passed out. When I woke up, the sun was high in the sky. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. It felt like a dream. My head hurt, my throat burned, my clothes were soaked and muddy. Then I heard a helicopter. The sound snapped me back into reality. I got up and ran in the direction it was flying. I followed it until I reached a cabin. There were cars there, a sheriff, people talking in urgent voices. When they realized who I was, everything changed. The sheriff took me to the hospital. Before we went inside, he asked me questions. The same questions, over and over. How did it happen? What did you see? Who shot him? I didn't have answers. I hadn't seen it happen. I didn't know where the shot came from. I just knew my dad was alive when I left him, and that I had failed to get help in time. Inside the hospital, I sat in the waiting room. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt like hours. The sheriff told me my uncle was coming to get me. When my uncle arrived, the doctor met him first. They talked quietly, away from me. I watched their faces. I watched my uncle's shoulders slump. Then he waved for me to come with him. We didn't go to see my dad. We left. That's when I knew. I didn't cry right away. I felt hollow, empty, like something essential had been ripped out of me. The world felt unreal, like I was watching it from far away. I am 60 years old now. Not a single night has passed since that day where I haven't dreamed about it. Sometimes it's exactly the same. The cold, the water, the gunshot, my dad running toward me. Sometimes it's different, but the fear is always there. I wake up with my heart racing, my chest tight, my throat sore from screaming in my sleep. That day never left me. It shaped my entire life. I learned that intuition is real, that sometimes your heart knows things before your mind can understand them. I learned how quickly everything can change, and how helpless a child can feel in a world that suddenly becomes cruel and confusing. I loved my father. I still do, and I carry that day with me every night, whether I want to or not. My freshman year of college was full of firsts. First time living away from home, first time sharing a space with someone I didn't really know, first time realizing that adulthood didn't come with clear instructions. I moved into a dorm room with a guy I had never met before. At first everything seemed normal enough. He was quiet, kept to himself, and didn't cause any obvious problems. Pretty quickly, though, I realized he was heavily into drugs. The strange thing was that he never did them in front of me. He never pressured me, never tried to involve me, and never talked openly about it in detail. Because of that, I kept telling myself it wasn't really my business. It didn't seem to directly affect me, and I didn't feel like I had the right or the courage to confront him about it. I was 18, trying to survive college, and conflict was the last thing I wanted. He had this routine he followed almost daily. He would tell me he was going fishing, grab a fishing rod, and leave the room. About 30 minutes later, he'd come back completely high out of his mind. His eyes would be glazed over, his movements slow and sloppy, his speech barely coherent. The part that made it especially unsettling was that there was nowhere to fish anywhere near campus. The closest place would have been at least 30 miles away. There was no way he could have gone fishing and come back in half an hour. We both knew it. But he still carried that fishing rod every time, like a prop in a bad lie, and I never called him out on it. Looking back, I think the fishing rod was more for himself than for me. Like pretending it was something normal made it easier to live with. One day he told me he was going fishing with a few friends. It sounded like the same routine, so I didn't think much of it. He left, fishing rod in hand, and I stayed behind, doing homework and half watching something on my laptop. About 20 minutes later, there was a loud pounding on our dorm door. Not a knock, pounding. I jumped up, confused, and opened it. What I saw made my stomach drop. My roommate was lying on the floor in the hallway, completely unconscious. Two guys I had never seen before were standing over him. They looked nervous, impatient, and uncomfortable, like they wanted to be anywhere else. They told me he had fallen asleep and that they had to carry him back. That explanation didn't make sense. People don't fall asleep like that. Not face down on a dorm hallway floor, completely unresponsive. They dragged him just inside the doorway and let him drop. Then they told me something that made everything worse. They said I absolutely could not tell the RA. They said my roommate was already on probation with the school, and that if anyone found out, he'd be kicked out. Before I could even fully process what was happening, they left, just walked away. I was suddenly alone with an unconscious person on my floor. I dragged him into our room, which felt surreal and heavy, like moving a body instead of a person. He was limp, dead weight. I managed to get him onto the couch, but he still didn't move. He didn't groan. He didn't react. Nothing. I tried to wake him up. I shook him. I called his name. I poured water on his face. I slapped his shoulder lightly, then harder. No response. His skin felt wrong, cold and clammy in a way that immediately made my chest tighten. At that point, panic finally broke through my hesitation. I called campus police. Then I ran to get the RA. Everything after that felt like it happened in fragments, like my brain couldn't keep up. Campus police arrived quickly. I explained everything I knew, that he was probably on drugs, that his friends had carried him back unconscious, that he hadn't moved or responded at all. One of the officers checked his pulse. His face changed instantly. He didn't have one. The room exploded into motion. Suddenly, there were officers everywhere. Radios crackling, someone telling me to step back, hands on his chest, someone trying to resuscitate him. Our tiny dorm living room filled with what felt like 8 people all working at once. I stood frozen, pressed against the wall, watching it happen. I remember thinking that this couldn't be real, that this was something that happened to other people, not me. Not in my dorm room, not with someone I lived with. They worked on him for what felt like forever. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I kept thinking that if he died right there, I would never be the same person again. Eventually, they brought him back. He suddenly gasped and started moving. But it wasn't relief. He came back angry. He started swinging his arms, punching at the people around him. He was still completely out of it, eyes wild, face red, screaming and swearing at everyone in the room. He looked at me and clenched his fist, like he wanted to hit me specifically. That look is burned into my memory. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was rage. The police restrained him and took control of the situation. One of the officers pulled me aside later and told me something I still think about to this day. He said that if I hadn't acted as quickly as I did, my roommate would have died on that couch. Not might have. Would have. Hearing that made my legs feel weak. I realized how close I had come to waking up the next morning to a dead body in our room. How easily I could have believed his friends and done nothing. How different my life could have been if I had hesitated. My roommate was kicked out of college shortly after that. I never saw him again on campus. He disappeared from my life as suddenly as he had collapsed into it. About 5 months later, I got a text from an unknown number. It was him. The message said that I had ruined his life, that everything bad that happened to him was my fault, that I would pay for it. Reading that text made my stomach twist. For a moment, fear crept back in. I wondered if he would show up, if he would hurt me, if saving his life had somehow made me his enemy. It's been 6 years since then. He never came after me. He never did anything beyond that message. I think I'm in the clear, but I still think about that night. I think about how close someone came to dying because of drugs. I think about how easily responsibility gets dumped onto the nearest person when things go wrong. I think about that bloodshot, furious look he gave me when he realized what had happened. And I think about how strange it is that doing the right thing can still make someone hate you. I don't regret calling for help. I don't regret saving his life. But that experience taught me something I didn't expect to learn so early in life. Sometimes stepping in doesn't make you a hero. Sometimes it makes you a target. And sometimes the scariest part isn't the emergency itself, but what comes after. This happened to my mom a few years after she first came to Los Angeles from Mexico, sometime in the 1970s. I've heard this story many times growing up. She first told it to me when I was about 10 years old, not to scare me for the sake of fear, but as a warning. She wanted me to understand, at a young age, that trust is complicated, and that sometimes the people who seem the kindest, the most helpful, or the closest to you can be the ones who put you in the most danger. When my mom arrived in Los Angeles, she was young, alone, and overwhelmed. She didn't have family in the country. She didn't have a support system. She barely spoke English. Everything was unfamiliar, loud, and fast, in a way that felt intimidating. Like many immigrants at the time, she took whatever work she could find, and she ended up working as a cleaner at the Omni Hotel downtown. The work was exhausting and thankless, but it paid enough to survive, and survival was all she was focused on back then. It was at that job that she met a woman who would eventually become her close friend. This woman worked alongside her cleaning rooms, hallways, and bathrooms day after day. They talked while they worked, sharing stories about their lives, their struggles, and their dreams. For my mom, who was painfully lonely and far from home, this connection meant everything. Someone spoke to her in a familiar way. Someone noticed her. Someone offered companionship in a city that made her feel invisible. The woman quickly took on the role of guide and protector. She showed my mom around Los Angeles, teaching her how to get around the city, where to shop, which buses to take, and which areas to avoid. She introduced her to restaurants, neighborhoods, and small pleasures that made the city feel less hostile. My mom, desperate for stability and kindness, accepted this help gratefully. Still, even back then, something didn't sit quite right. My mom noticed early on that her friend had a serious problem with stealing. Not small things here and there, but constant theft. She stole items from work, slipping hotel supplies into her bag. She stole from convenience stores, clothing shops, and anywhere else she thought she could get away with it. She bragged about it sometimes, laughing as if it were harmless or clever. At first, my mom tried to ignore it. She told herself it wasn't her business. She was new, vulnerable, and didn't want to risk losing the only friend she had. But over time, the unease grew. There were moments when things went missing from my mom's apartment. Jewelry, perfume, small personal items. My mom could never prove anything, but deep down she suspected her friend was responsible. There was also the boyfriend. From the very beginning, he made my mom uncomfortable. He was loud, arrogant, and openly sexist. He spoke about women like they were objects. When my mom was around, he stared at her in a way that made her skin crawl. He leered, smiled too, long, and made comments that crossed every boundary. My mom learned that this man was dangerous in more ways than one. He had committed several robberies and somehow managed to avoid being caught. He carried a gun everywhere he went. He was violent, unpredictable, and proud of it. Being in the same room as him made my mom's heart race, but again, she told herself she was overreacting. She didn't want to seem rude. She didn't want to offend the only friend she had. Despite all of this, the friend continued to insert herself deeper into my mom's life. She was helpful, energetic, and constantly present. She offered rides. She invited my mom out. She acted protective like an older sister or a guardian. And my mom, isolated and homesick, clung to that companionship, even as her instincts warned her to be careful. One night, the friend and her boyfriend invited my mom out to dinner. They said they wanted to treat her. The idea of being included, of being cared for, made my mom say yes. They went to a restaurant together, ate, talked, and for a while, everything felt normal. The boyfriend behaved himself. The friend laughed and joked like usual. Nothing seemed off. After dinner, instead of taking my mom home, they decided to drive around for a while. Los Angeles at night felt strange and endless, full of glowing lights and empty streets. Eventually, they said they wanted to stop and get donuts. They parked the car near a donut shop, and the friend got out to go inside. Time passed. The friend took longer than expected. At first, my mom tried not to worry. Maybe the line was long. Maybe she ran into someone she knew. But as the minutes dragged on, a tight feeling grew in her chest. She was alone in the car with the boyfriend, the man who had always made her feel unsafe. Then it happened. Without warning, the man tried to sexually assault her. He moved quickly, aggressively, ignoring her protests. My mom froze at first, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She tried to push him away, to shout, to defend herself. She was terrified, trapped in a parked car in the middle of the night with a man she knew carried a gun. Then the friend came back. She opened the car door and saw what was happening, and she laughed. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look angry. She didn't ask if my mom was okay. She laughed and told my mom to calm down, as if the assault were some kind of joke or misunderstanding. In that moment, my mom understood the truth in a way that hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad timing. This was planned. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, my mom managed to break free. She shoved the man away, threw herself out of the car, and ran. She ran through the dark streets of downtown Los Angeles, not knowing where she was going, only knowing she couldn't stop. Her heart pounded in her ears. Her lungs burned. Every shadow felt like a threat. She didn't look back. She made it home somehow, shaking and terrified. In the days that followed, fear ruled her life. She barely slept. She jumped at every noise. She constantly looked over her shoulder, convinced that the friend or her boyfriend would show up at her apartment. A few weeks later, she moved. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She changed her routines. She disappeared from that part of the city as completely as she could. The woman she had once considered a friend never showed up to work again. She vanished just like that. Looking back, my mom realized what had really happened. The woman hadn't befriended her out of kindness. She had targeted her, a young immigrant, alone, vulnerable, someone with no family to protect her. She had earned my mom's trust, gained access to her life, and then handed her over to her boyfriend like an object. That realization stayed with my mom forever. When she told me this story as a child, her voice was calm but heavy. She wanted me to understand that danger doesn't always look like a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes it looks like a smiling coworker. Sometimes it looks like help. Sometimes it looks like friendship. She survived because she listened to her instincts. In the moment it mattered most, and because she ran. Even now, decades later, that story carries a weight that never disappears. It shapes. If these stories feel familiar, there's a reason. Most people have experienced something they don't talk about. If you're still listening, leave a like and subscribe. It helps keep stories like these alive. And if something has ever followed you home, send it in. Let's continue. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. When I was a teenager, my cousin was one of those people who seemed to attract attention everywhere she went, whether she wanted it or not. She was strikingly beautiful, with blonde hair and a very adult-looking body at a young age. Because of that, she drew the wrong kind of attention far more often than anyone should have to deal with, especially someone who was still basically a kid. Her childhood wasn't easy. Her parents were divorced, and while they both loved her in their own way, neither of them was particularly attentive or protective the way they should have been. She was given a lot of freedom very early on, far more than most kids her age. She dressed provocatively long before she fully understood how the world would react to that, and she was allowed to spend time with older men when she should have been protected from them. At the time, none of us really understood how dangerous that combination could be. To her, it probably felt like freedom and attention and being grown up. To the people watching from the outside, especially the wrong people, it made her a target. Once she got her driver's license and her own car, things escalated. Having independence meant she could come and go without anyone really checking where she was or who she was with. Around that time, she had been seeing an older guy, one of several men who had no business being involved with someone her age. Eventually, she broke things off with him. He did not take it well. From what we later pieced together, he seemed obsessed. He thought he could win her back, or control her, or punish her for leaving him. Whatever was going on in his head, it wasn't healthy, and it definitely wasn't safe. There were signs, looking back, that he wasn't handling the breakup well at all, but at the time, no one fully grasped just how serious it was. One night, her younger brother was coming home. He was younger than her, but he was observant and cautious in a way that probably saved her life. As he walked toward the house, he noticed someone lingering near her car. The car was parked outside, and the person wasn't just passing by. They were standing too close, moving around it, clearly focused on it. Something felt off to him immediately. Instead of ignoring it or assuming it was nothing, he decided to hang back and watch. He didn't approach. He didn't confront the person. He just waited, keeping his distance, his instincts telling him that this was not a normal situation. That decision made all the difference. He watched as the man moved to the back of the car and opened the trunk. This alone was alarming, but what happened next was far worse. The man climbed into the trunk. In that particular car, you could access the back seat from inside the trunk. He was clearly planning to hide there and wait. Wait for her to come back out of the house. Wait for her to get into the car. The implications of that are horrifying. There is no innocent explanation for someone hiding in a car trunk like that. Whatever he intended to do, it wasn't good. It could have ended in assault, kidnapping, or worse. The fact that he was willing to hide like that showed planning, patience, and a complete disregard for her safety or autonomy. Her brother didn't hesitate. As soon as he realized what was happening, he called the police. At the same time, he ran into the house to warn his sister. He told her exactly what he had seen, and thankfully, she listened immediately. She didn't brush it off or question him. She stayed inside while they waited for help. The police arrived and handled the situation before the man could do anything else. I don't know all the legal details of what happened after that, but what matters is that he was stopped before he could hurt her. It's hard to even think about what might have happened if her brother hadn't come home when he did. If he had been a few minutes later. If he hadn't been paying attention. If he had assumed it was none of his business and gone straight inside. She could have walked out to her car completely unaware that someone was hiding inside, waiting for her. That thought still makes my stomach drop. In our family, this story eventually became something of an uncomfortable joke. Not because it was funny, but because humor is sometimes the only way people know how to cope with fear after the fact. It gets told at gatherings in a lighter tone now, framed as one of those "can you believe that happened?" moments. But beneath that, it's still deeply unsettling. It's terrifying to realize how close someone you love can come to real danger without even knowing it. It's terrifying how easily predators can insert themselves into someone's life, especially when that person is young, vulnerable, and not properly protected. And it's terrifying to think about how often these situations probably end very differently, simply because no one happened to be watching. Her brother doesn't get enough credit for what he did that night. He trusted his instincts. He paid attention. He acted quickly. Because of him, she got to grow up, move on, and build a life beyond that moment. Years later, she's a completely different person. Stronger, wiser, more aware of the world and its dangers. But that night is still a reminder of how exposed she was back then, and how close she came to something truly horrific. It's easy to look back and judge the adults who should have been paying attention, who should have set boundaries, who should have stepped in earlier. But the truth is, situations like this happen far more often than people want to admit. They don't always come with dramatic warnings or obvious villains. Sometimes they come quietly in the form of someone waiting in the dark, hidden just out of sight. That night could have changed everything. And the fact that it didn't comes down to one person being alert when it mattered most. This all happened in the early 2000s, and it's a story my mom and a close family friend told me many times as I got older. I was only 2 or 3 years old at the time, so everything I know about it comes from them. Some of the details are a little fuzzy because so much time has passed, but the core of the story has never changed, and every time I think about it, it still sends a chill through me. Back then, we lived in a small town, quiet and familiar, the kind of place where most people knew each other. The nearest big city was about 30 miles away, and trips there were a bit of an event. That day, my mom, my grandmother, and a family friend had gone into the city together. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. Errands, maybe some shopping, nothing special. I was just a toddler strapped into my car seat, probably half asleep most of the time. On the way home, everything went wrong. They were driving back toward our town when we were involved in a very bad car accident. Don't know exactly how it happened, whether another car cut them off or traffic suddenly stopped. But from the way it was described to me, it was violent and chaotic. Metal crumpled, glass shattered, and the sudden force threw everything into confusion. Our family friend who was driving was shaken but not seriously hurt. She managed to pull the car over to the side of the road as safely as she could. My grandmother and my mom were injured badly enough that paramedics were called immediately. When the emergency crews arrived, everything became loud and overwhelming. Sirens, flashing lights, people shouting instructions. My mom was in shock. She was hurt, scared, and completely focused on one thing: me. She kept asking the same questions over and over. Where is my baby? Is my baby okay? Let me see my baby. According to everyone there, she was frantic, trying to get out of the car, trying to see me, trying to make sure I was alive and unharmed. The paramedics were trying to calm her down while also doing their jobs, checking injuries, getting people stabilized, and preparing to move them into ambulances. My grandmother was taken into one of the ambulances fairly quickly. The paramedics were still working with my mom, helping her, talking to her, trying to keep her from panicking. In the middle of all that chaos, something else happened that almost no one noticed at first. Another vehicle had pulled over. From what my family friend remembers, it was a white van. It had been driving behind us fairly closely before the crash, close enough that it was noticeable. When we stopped, the van stopped too. At first, that didn't seem strange. Accidents attract attention. Sometimes people stop to help, or at least to see what happened. But then the side door of the van opened and an elderly woman got out. She was described as an old Asian woman, but very pale, almost white in complexion. That detail mattered later. She moved quickly, with purpose, not like someone who was confused or concerned, but like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. While the paramedics were focused on my mom and grandmother, and while my mom was desperately asking about me, this woman walked straight toward the car. Toward me. I was still strapped into my car seat. No one noticed at first because everyone's attention was split. My grandmother was already in an ambulance. My mom was being prepared to be moved. The paramedics were busy. The road was loud. Sirens were blaring. The old woman reached into the car and tried to take me out of my car seat. That moment still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. The only reason she didn't succeed was because of our family friend. Our family friend saw what was happening and immediately knew something was wrong. This woman wasn't a paramedic. She wasn't a police officer. She wasn't wearing any uniform. And she wasn't someone we knew. Our family friend ran over and started yelling at her. She shouted that the woman needed to get away, that she wasn't family, that she had no right to touch me. She made it loud and clear, not just for the woman, but for the paramedics too, that this person was a complete stranger. This is where the detail about appearance became important. We are Filipino, our family friend, my mom, my grandmother, and I, all share that light brown tan complexion common in Filipino families. This woman, by contrast, was extremely pale. When our family friend yelled that she wasn't family, it became obvious to everyone around that this woman didn't belong there. The old woman didn't argue. She didn't explain herself. She didn't try to pretend she was helping anymore. She ran. She turned around and rushed back toward the van. As she did, the back door of the van was still open, and for a brief moment, our family friend saw inside. There were other children in the van. Children of different races, different ages, sitting in back. The woman slammed the door shut and sped off as fast as she could, disappearing before the authorities or paramedics could stop her or even fully understand what had just happened. By the time anyone tried to react, the van was gone. From what my family friend remembers, the van was plain white with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that blends in, the kind you wouldn't look twice at under normal circumstances. No clear markings, nothing obvious that would make it stand out later. After everything settled down, after my mom and grandmother were taken care of, the realization hit. That woman hadn't been there to help. She had been there for me. If our family friend hadn't been watching closely, if she hadn't trusted her instincts, if she hadn't spoken up when she did, I could have been taken. In the middle of that chaos, with my mom injured and distracted, my grandmother already gone in an ambulance and paramedics overwhelmed, it would have been terrifyingly easy. I could have disappeared. That thought has haunted my family ever since. We don't know who that woman was. We don't know where she came from or where she went. We don't know who those children in the van were or what was happening to them. We don't know if she was acting alone or as part of something bigger. All we know is that she saw an opportunity and almost took it. When I was older and first heard this story, I remember feeling sick to my stomach. It's strange hearing about a moment that could have changed your entire life when you have no memory of it yourself. I don't remember the crash. I don't remember the sirens. I don't remember the woman reaching for me. But my life could have gone in a completely different direction because of that one moment. The story has stayed with me, not just because of how close it was, but because of how ordinary it all looked from the outside. A car accident, a woman stopping to help, a moment of confusion. Predators don't always look scary. They don't always snatch and run in dark alleys. Sometimes they wait for chaos. Sometimes they blend in. Sometimes they rely on people being distracted. I am here today because one person paid attention, because one person refused to assume good intentions, because one person was brave enough to yell, to cause a scene, to step in. Every time I think about it, I feel a strange mix of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that I was protected. Fear knowing how easily things could have gone the other way. It's a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in the middle of an already terrible day, waiting for the right moment to act. I work as a counselor at a Christian summer camp in Vermont. The camp is extremely remote. When I say remote, I don't mean a short drive outside town. I mean 4 hours from anything that could reasonably be called a town. There is one tiny place nearby with maybe 2 small shops, and that's it. Other than that, it's nothing but trees, dirt roads, mountains, and long stretches of silence. No streetlights, no nearby houses, just cabins, forest, and darkness once the sun goes down. The camp serves boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 16. During the day, it feels safe and lively. Kids running around, laughter, songs, games, chapel, normal camp stuff. But at night, the place feels completely different. The woods close in. Sounds carry farther. Every snap of a branch or rustle in the leaves feels louder than it should. One night, I was assigned to overnight security. It's not really called security officially, but that's basically what it is. The job is to walk the grounds with another counselor and make sure campers don't sneak out of their cabins, don't mess around near the lake, and don't wander where they shouldn't. It's mostly boring. 99% of the time, nothing happens. You just walk, whisper jokes to stay awake, and wait for your shift to end. That night, my partner was my friend Gabe. We'd both done this duty before. We weren't nervous or expecting anything unusual. It was late, the kind of late where the camp is completely quiet. No voices, no lights in the cabins, except maybe a dim glow from a counselor's flashlight. Just crickets wind through the trees, and our footsteps on the dirt paths. We were walking one of the longer routes that loops around the cabins. On one side are the boys' cabins, and farther down the path, separated by trees and distance, are the girls' cabins. There are strict rules about that area at night, obviously. No one should be anywhere near the girls' cabins except female, counselors or staff with permission. As we were walking, I noticed movement ahead of us. At first, it didn't register as anything serious. You get used to seeing shadows, counselors checking on cabins, or even deer wandering through camp. But then I realized this figure was walking directly toward the girls' cabin area. I pointed it out to Gabe. We both slowed down and watched for a second. Our first assumption was that it might be one of the older male campers trying something stupid, like sneaking over to wake up a girl's cabin or meeting someone. That kind of thing happens occasionally, and usually it's harmless teenage stupidity. Still against the rules, but not dangerous. The closer the figure got, the more wrong it felt. The person was dressed entirely in black. Black hoodie, black pants. The hood was up, even though it wasn't cold enough to justify it. We couldn't see their face at all. No flashlight, no badge, no camp gear. Nothing that suggested they belonged there. That's when the unease hit me fully. This wasn't a camper. This wasn't a counselor. This was an adult man walking through the woods toward the girls' cabins in the middle of the night. We called out, trying to keep our voices steady. "Hey, who's there?" The moment he heard us, everything changed. He froze for half a second, just long enough for me to see his body tense, and then he took off running. Not away from the cabins, straight toward the parking lot. Adrenaline slammed into my system. I remember my heart pounding so hard, it felt like it was in my throat. Gabe immediately sprinted after him. I hesitated for just a moment, torn between chasing and trying to call for help. My phone had barely any service out there on a good day, but I pulled it out anyway, fumbling with it as I started moving after them. Gabe was faster than I expected. He caught up to the man just before the tree line opened up toward the parking area. I saw him tackle the guy too, the ground. They both went down hard. I ran closer, but my focus was split. I was desperately trying to get a signal on my phone, holding it up, moving it around, watching the screen flicker between no service and 1 bar. My hands were shaking so badly it was hard to even unlock the phone. While I was doing that, Gabe managed to pull the hood off the man. That's when I finally got a clear look at him. He was in his 30s, maybe late 30s. A grown man, not a teenager, not someone who could possibly be confused for a camper. His face wasn't familiar at all. I had never seen him before in my life. And that's when the reality of where we were hit me all at once. This camp is hours away from civilization. You don't just wander onto this property by accident. You don't just get lost and end up walking toward children's cabins at night. This man had driven here on purpose. While Gabe was trying to hold him down, the guy started fighting back hard. I heard shouting, swearing, and then I saw the man land a punch directly into Gabe's eye. Gabe cried out and stumbled back. The man didn't wait another second. He bolted. He sprinted the rest of the way to the parking lot, jumped into a car, and peeled out of there as fast as he could. Tires spinning, engine roaring, disappearing down the long dirt road that leads away from camp. By the time I finally got enough service to even think about calling the police, he was gone. We stood there in shock. Gabe was bleeding around his eye, already swelling. I felt sick. My legs were weak. Neither of us knew what to say. The woods felt different now, closer, darker, like something had just brushed past us that we were never meant to encounter. We didn't know what to do next. Calling the police felt pointless at that moment. We didn't have a license plate. We didn't have a name. We barely had a description. And even if we did call, response time would be long, extremely long. The only thing we could think to do was get somewhere safe and stay there. We went straight to the food hall, locked ourselves inside, turned on every light we could, and stayed there for the rest of our shift. Neither of us slept. Every noise outside made us jump. Every shadow near the windows made my stomach drop. All I could think about was how close that man had been to the girls' cabins. What if we had been 5 minutes later? What if we hadn't noticed him? What if he hadn't run? Those questions haunted me for weeks after. I still don't know who that man was or what he planned to do, but I know one thing for sure. He didn't belong there, and the fact that he was willing to punch his way free and flee tells me he wasn't lost, confused, or harmless. That night changed how I see quiet places. It taught me that danger doesn't always come with warning signs, and sometimes it shows up in places you think are protected, isolated, and safe. And it still makes my skin crawl knowing that if Gabe hadn't tackled him, or if we hadn't been on that path at that exact moment, the story could have ended very differently. I work for a company that designs and builds very large conveyor systems used in coal mining. These are not small machines. The belts themselves are massive, usually somewhere between 1,400 and 1,800 millimeters wide, and they can stretch on for kilometers underground. When people imagine conveyor belts, they often picture something slow and harmless, like the ones at grocery stores or airports. These are nothing like that. These belts move steadily, usually between 3 and 10 meters per second. To put that into perspective, an average person walks at about 1.5 meters per second. So while the belt does not look like it is flying, it is fast enough that once you are on it, keeping your footing becomes very difficult very quickly. Modern conveyor systems are designed with many safety features. One of the most important is something called a man-on-belt switch. This is essentially a long wire or cable that runs along the length of the conveyor. If someone somehow ends up on the belt, all they need to do is raise their arm and touch or lift that wire, and the entire system shuts down immediately. It is meant as a last line of defense. something that can save a life in the worst possible situation. However, not all conveyor systems have this feature. Many older systems were built before safety standards became as strict as they are now. Back in the early days of mining, it was apparently common practice for workers to actually sit on the conveyor belt to ride it into or out of the mine. It sounds insane now, but that was just how things were done. Over time, regulations changed, and now it is very difficult to accidentally end up on a moving belt. There are guards around moving parts, warning systems, procedures, and rules stacked on top of rules. Despite all of that, accidents still happen. I heard this story from some of the older employees at my company, the kind of guys who have been in mining their entire lives and have seen things they don't talk about unless the conversation drifts there on its own. No jokes, no exaggeration, just quiet voices and long pauses. This particular incident happened years ago, but everyone who knows about it talks about it with the same tone, the same unease. It was a freak accident, but the terrifying part is that nothing about it is impossible even today. The man involved was a miner performing maintenance underground. At the time, the conveyor belt was stopped. This is important because it means he wasn't doing anything reckless. He wasn't breaking rules. He wasn't riding the belt. He was simply standing on it while it was stationary, doing some kind of routine maintenance work. Something that had probably been done hundreds of times before without incident. Then the roof collapsed. In the mines I have personally worked in or seen, the roof is reinforced with heavy wire mesh. This mesh is designed to stop small rocks from falling and injuring workers. Above that mesh is tons of rock, dirt, and earth, held in place by pressure, structure, and reinforcement. Most of the time, the system works exactly as intended, but sometimes a section fails. A panel of the wire mesh gave way, along with a large amount of rock above it. It didn't completely bury the man, but it came down on top of him with enough force to pin him in place. The weight crushed him against the conveyor belt beneath his feet. He was trapped, unable to move, unable to stand up, unable to roll away. The mesh itself is what sealed his fate. If it had just been loose rocks, there's a chance he might have been able to push them aside or crawl out. But the mesh is rigid, heavy, and unforgiving. It pressed him down, holding him there like a cage. He was alive. Injured, yes, but alive. Conscious enough to understand what had just happened. And he was alone. Mining tunnels are dark, even with lights. Sound carries strangely. Depending on where you are, you can be completely isolated without realizing it. No one saw the collapse happen. No one heard him. He couldn't reach a radio. He couldn't trigger any alarms. He was pinned to the belt. At some point after the collapse, the warning siren sounded. In mines, before a conveyor belt starts moving, there is a loud, audible alarm. It's meant to give workers time to clear the area. Anyone who works underground knows that sound intimately. When you hear it, your body reacts automatically. He would have heard it. Lying there in the dark, crushed under rock and wire, he would have heard the siren echo through the tunnel. He would have known exactly what it meant. He would have known that the belt was about to start. There was nothing he could do. When the conveyor started, it would have begun slowly, a vibration at first, a deep, mechanical rumble beneath him, then movement, the belt inching forward, then gaining speed. He would have felt his body dragged along, still pinned by the mesh, carried forward against his will. At the end of that conveyor was a crusher. A crusher is not something most people can picture accurately. It isn't like a simple grinder. It's an industrial machine designed to destroy rock. Two massive steel cylinders spin at high speed. They are covered in spikes. The spikes protrude outward and then bend at a right angle, with extremely hard, wear-resistant tips bolted onto them. Coal enters the machine and comes out the other side, broken into much smaller pieces, ready for the next stage of processing. Human bodies are far weaker than coal. No one witnessed what happened next. Everything that follows is inferred from what was found later, from how the system works, from the absence of anything else. The man would have been dragged into the crusher along with the coal. There would have been no sudden stop, no dramatic interruption. The system would have continued running as designed. Part of coal processing involves washing. Large amounts of water are used to clean the coal before it is transported further. Because of this, there likely wasn't much visible blood. Anything that remained would have been diluted, washed away, mixed into tons of material moving through the system. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was far too late. The only thing they ever found belonging to him was his wedding ring. It was discovered off to the side of the conveyor belt. Based on its location and condition, the conclusion was that he had intentionally removed it and thrown it aside while the belt was moving. That single detail haunts everyone who hears this story. It means that at some point, pinned and being carried toward his death, he was still conscious enough to make a choice. He took off the one thing that symbolized his life outside the mine, his wife, his family, and made sure it wouldn't be destroyed with him. That ring was the only proof he had been there at all. His body was never recovered, and realistically, there was nothing to recover. By the time the coal reached the surface, it would have been mixed with hundreds of tons of material, scooped up by massive machines loaded onto railway cars, sent off to power stations. Whatever remained of him would have been scattered beyond recognition. They didn't bother searching, not out of cruelty, but out of grim practicality. There was nowhere to look and nothing to find. When the older workers talk about this incident, there's always a heavy silence afterward. It's not just the violence of it, it's the helplessness, the knowledge that he followed procedures, that he wasn't reckless, that he was doing his job, and still everything went wrong in the worst possible way. It's a reminder that even with safety systems, even with modern engineering, there are moments where all the safeguards in the world mean nothing. One failure, one collapse, one wrong place at the wrong time. I think about that story often when I'm working around conveyors. I think about how massive and indifferent these machines are. They don't know if something is coal or steel or human. They just move. They crush. They do exactly what they were built to do. And I think about that wedding ring lying alone beside the belt, the last quiet sign of a man who knew what was coming and had no way to stop it. It happened one quiet summer morning about 26 years ago, back in a time when cell phones were not yet part of everyday life. Landlines were still king. Answering machines were a luxury, and if the phone rang early in the morning, you usually assumed it was something important. I was just about to leave for work. I remember being in a hurry, keys in hand, mentally running through everything I needed to get done that day. As I stepped toward the door, the telephone rang. I almost ignored it, but something made me stop and turn back. I picked up the receiver. On the other end was a young man. His voice was calm, polite, and well-spoken. There was nothing aggressive or obviously alarming about him. He asked, very politely, if he could speak to my daughter. My daughter was 14 years old at the time. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I have always been an overprotective mother. I don't apologize for it. I knew my daughter's friends. I knew the boys she talked to. I knew the way teenage boys sounded when they called the house. Awkward, nervous, trying to sound older than they were. This voice did not match that. Something about it set off every alarm bell in my body. I asked him, calmly but firmly, how old he was. There was a brief pause, just a fraction of a second, and then he answered politely that he was 21. That was all I needed to hear. I told him in no uncertain terms that my 14-year-old daughter was not in the habit of receiving phone calls from 21-year-old men. I told him that if he ever called my house again asking for her, I would contact the police. I asked him, in my most serious, no-nonsense, don't-test-me mother voice, if he understood what I was saying. He said yes. I slammed the receiver down. I was angry, but also uneasy. I remember standing there for a moment, staring at the phone, feeling that tight knot in my stomach that comes when something doesn't feel right, but you can't quite explain why. I shook it off, told myself I was just being paranoid, grabbed my things, and went to work. Later that day, I told a colleague about the call. She laughed it off and joked that I was just being a classic overprotective mom. I laughed too, because that's what you do. Life went on. Days passed. Weeks passed. The incident faded into the background of everyday life. Then one morning, everything changed. A few weeks after that phone call, I stepped outside to leave for work and picked up the newspaper from the front step. The moment I saw the front page, my heart dropped. They had found the remains of a young girl in a heavily wooded rural area. The headline was stark and unforgiving. Beneath it was a name: Tina Franks. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. My daughter had two casual friends from our old neighborhood named Tina. I didn't know which one it was, but fear flooded through me anyway. I walked back into the house, my hands shaking slightly, and went to my daughter's bedroom. Anyone who has ever had a 14-year-old during summer vacation knows how hard it is to wake them. I didn't wake her. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I placed the newspaper gently on her nightstand and left for work, my mind racing the entire drive. I hadn't even settled into my office when the phone rang. It was my daughter. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. When she finally managed to get the words out, she told me it was her friend Tina. The Tina from her old neighborhood. The one from the newspaper. I left work immediately and went home to be with her. Over the next days and weeks, the horrifying details came out piece by piece, each one worse than the last. The RCMP had discovered Tina's remains only after an entirely separate incident led them to the area. A young man had been found bound and bleeding near the Trans-Canada Highway. He told police that he had been in the woods drinking with a man and two teenage girls. At some point, he was struck over the head with a bat and lost consciousness. When he woke up, he was tied up. Somehow injured and terrified, he managed to free himself and make his way to the highway, where he was found. The police immediately launched a search. About 7 hours later, they found the man described by the victim. He was in a van with two teenage girls. Both girls had been raped and beaten. The assaults had been videotaped. The level of cruelty was beyond comprehension. While searching the surrounding area for evidence, police found Tina's remains. The full weight of it all felt unbearable. Tina had been a normal teenage girl. She had friends, plans, a life that should have stretched decades into the future. Instead, it ended violently, senselessly, in the woods. A few days after the news broke, the police called our house. They wanted to speak with my daughter. They needed to ask her questions about the last time she had seen Tina. According to my daughter, she had seen Tina at a downtown bus stop toward the end of the school year. Tina had tried to convince her to go to a party with her. My daughter had said no. She was meeting me at my office that evening, and we had plans to go out to dinner and a movie together. Ordinary plans, innocent plans, plans that unknowingly kept her safe. The police asked my daughter to describe what Tina had been wearing that day. From what we later understood, my daughter was the last known person to see Tina before she met her killer. The most chilling detail of all came later. The police found my daughter because Tina's killer had her address book. Our phone number was in it, underlined. When I learned that, my blood ran cold. That phone call from weeks earlier came flooding back into my mind. The polite voice, the age he admitted to, the way my instincts screamed that something was wrong. I am convinced, deep in my bones, that I spoke to the man who murdered my daughter's friend. I believe that when I picked up that phone, when I challenged him, when I threatened to call the police, I interrupted whatever plan he had. I believe that by being rude, by being firm, by being what some people might call an overbearing mother, I saved my daughter's life. That knowledge is something I carry with me every single day. My daughter grew up. She healed as best she could from the trauma of losing a friend in such a horrific way. Today, she is married. She has 2 beautiful daughters of her own. She is a wonderful mother. Her girls affectionately call her Mama Bear. They say it because she is protective, because she is watchful, because she trusts her instincts and doesn't worry about being polite when it comes to her children's safety. Every time I hear them say it, my heart swells, because I know exactly where she learned it from, and because I know without a single doubt that sometimes being an overbearing, instinct-driven, unapologetic parent isn't a flaw. Sometimes it's the reason your child gets to grow up at all. At the time this happened, my partner and I were living in a place that was barely big enough to call an apartment. The best way I can describe it is a shoebox stacked on top of another shoebox. The layout was strange, but simple. When you walked in through the front door, you stepped straight into the kitchen. There was no hallway, no living room, no buffer space at all, just the kitchen. Above that, up a narrow set of stairs, was the bedroom and a small bathroom. The bedroom had a large window that faced the outside. It wasn't street level, but it also wasn't especially high. If someone stood on a ladder, a crate, or even something like a bike, they could reach it. At the time, I didn't think much of that. We lived in a fairly normal area, nothing fancy, but not especially dangerous either. I felt safe enough, comfortable enough. That sense of safety didn't last. One afternoon, I decided to run to the small store next to our house. I wasn't planning to be gone long. I didn't take my phone with me because I was literally just grabbing a couple of things. I was gone for maybe 15 minutes, 20 at the absolute most. When I came back, everything seemed normal at first. I unlocked the front door, stepped into the kitchen, and closed the door behind me. That's when I heard noise coming from upstairs from the bedroom. It wasn't loud exactly, but it was enough to make me pause. Something shifting, a faint rustle, the kind of sound that makes your brain start filling in gaps. My first thought was completely harmless. I assumed maybe I had left the bedroom window open and a bird had gotten inside. That had happened to friends of mine before. Or I thought maybe my partner had come home early from work and was moving around upstairs. I called out his name, half joking, asking why he was home so early. Then someone answered me. It wasn't my partner. The voice that came back was a man's voice, speaking in a language I didn't understand. It was fast, unfamiliar, and completely wrong. For a split second, my brain refused to accept what was happening. It felt unreal, like my mind was lagging behind the situation. Then it hit me all at once. There was a stranger in my bedroom. My body reacted before my thoughts fully caught up. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I felt a rush of heat and cold at the same time. Panic surged through me, sharp and immediate. I started screaming. I yelled at him to get out of my house. I shouted that I was calling the police. I don't remember exactly what words I used or how loud I was, but I know I was screaming with everything I had. My voice didn't even sound like my own. Almost immediately, I heard frantic movement upstairs. The bedroom window began shaking violently. The blinds rattled and were shoved aside. I could hear the window frame creaking, the sound of someone scrambling, desperate to get out. Then it went quiet. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. My whole body was trembling. I stood there in the kitchen, frozen, listening, trying to decide what to do next. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of the house, but my phone was upstairs on the bed. I waited a few seconds, my breath shallow, my ears straining for any sound. When I didn't hear anything else, I forced myself to move. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, my legs shaking so badly I almost tripped. The bedroom was in chaos. The window was wide open. The blinds were twisted and pushed aside. Cold air rushed in from outside. My phone was still on the bed where I had left it. I grabbed it with shaking hands and dialed the police immediately. While I was on the phone, I kept scanning the room, half expecting the man to still be there, hiding somewhere. The operator tried to calm me down while taking my information. My voice was breaking, my words tumbling over each other as I tried to explain what had happened. The police arrived and searched the house, but the man was gone. Outside, they found how he had gotten in. He had dragged an old bicycle up against the side of the building and used it to climb through the bedroom window. He hadn't even tried to be subtle. It was clear he had been watching, waiting, timing my movements. The officers told me something that made my stomach drop even further. They said it was very likely that this man had been watching my house for some time, learning my routine, waiting for the exact moment I left. They believed I had walked in just as he finished getting inside. If I had stayed at the store a few minutes longer, he would have had more time alone in my bedroom, more time to decide what to do. They also told me something else, something I still think about to this day. There was no guarantee he wouldn't come back. That sentence lodged itself deep inside me. It replayed in my head over and over. No guarantee he wouldn't come back. The idea that someone had violated my home, had been inside my private space, and could possibly return made my skin crawl. After the police left, the house didn't feel like home anymore. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked wrong. The bedroom especially felt contaminated. I couldn't stop picturing him standing there, answering me when I called out, knowing exactly where I was. That night, I barely slept. In the days that followed, fear settled into my routine in a way I had never experienced before. Leaving the house became terrifying. Every morning when I had to go to work, my stomach twisted into knots. I'd stand by the door, listening, checking locks, convincing myself it was safe to step outside. I started imagining him watching again, from somewhere nearby, from across the street, from behind a car. The thought that someone could observe your habits, learn your schedule, and wait for the right moment was deeply unsettling. Even after extra locks were installed and the window was secured, the fear didn't go away right away. Trust, once broken like that, takes time to rebuild. Home is supposed to be the one place where you feel safe without thinking. After that day, safety became something I had to actively work to feel again. Looking back, what scares me most isn't just that there was a robber in my house. It's how ordinary everything was right before it happened. I left for 15 minutes. I did nothing reckless. I didn't live somewhere isolated or obviously dangerous. It could have happened to anyone. That experience changed the way I see my surroundings forever. It taught me how quickly a normal day can turn into something terrifying and how fragile the feeling of safety really is. Even now, years later, I still double-check windows. I still listen closely when I walk through the door, and I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of a stranger's voice answering me from my own bedroom. When I was around 7 years old, my family took what was supposed to be a fun, memorable vacation to Hawaii. At that age, everything felt magical already. The plane ride, the warm air when we stepped outside, the ocean everywhere you looked. I remember feeling like we were somewhere unreal, like we had stepped into a movie. My parents were excited too. They liked the idea of doing things that weren't overly touristy, things that felt more authentic. especially if they were cheap or free. At some point early in the trip, my parents started talking to a few locals. I don't remember where exactly this happened, maybe at a small shop or near where we were staying, but I remember the conversation stuck with them. The locals told my parents about an old irrigation canal that people sometimes went inner tubing through. They described it like an adventure, something locals knew about, but tourists usually didn't. They even mentioned that parts of Jurassic Park had been filmed nearby, which immediately made it sound cooler and more exciting. To my parents, this sounded perfect. It was free, it was outdoors, it wasn't crowded, and it sounded like something fun the whole family could do together. They didn't look it up online. They didn't tell anyone where we were going. They didn't ask park rangers or guides. They just decided we'd do it. We went to a dollar store and bought cheap inner tubes, the kind you'd normally use in a swimming pool. Then we packed into the car and started driving. The farther we went, the more the scenery changed. Paved roads turned into rough gravel. Houses disappeared. There were no signs, no other cars, no people. Just greenery, dirt roads, and this growing sense that we were very far from anywhere familiar. Eventually, we reached what we thought was the place. On either side of the road were these old irrigation canals. Some sections were open on top, with water flowing visibly through them. Other sections disappeared into covered tunnels, dark and rectangular, cutting through the earth. The tunnels alternated between open and closed stretches, like the water was constantly slipping underground and then reappearing again. To my parents, it still seemed fine, adventurous even. To me, it was already a little scary, but I was 7. I trusted my parents completely. If they said it was okay, then it must be okay. My dad decided to test it first. He threw one of the inner tubes into the water and watched it drift into the first tunnel. We all stood there waiting, watching the dark opening, listening to the sound of rushing water echoing inside. After a moment, the tube popped out the other side, still intact. That was all the confirmation my parents needed. They said it was safe enough. One by one, we climbed into our inner tubes and let the current pull us in. The first tunnel wasn't bad. It was dark but short. The water moved quickly, but not violently. I remember feeling a little nervous, but also kind of excited. When we came out into the open section again, sunlight hit my eyes and I relaxed. I thought, okay, this is fine, this is fun. Then we tried to get out. That's when we realized the current was stronger than it looked. The water was moving too fast to stand up in. Every time we tried to grab the sides and climb out, the current pulled us forward again. The canal walls were slick and steep, and there was nothing to grab onto. We were being carried forward whether we wanted to or not. Ahead of us was the second tunnel. This one was much longer. The opening swallowed us whole. As soon as we entered, everything went black. Not dim, not shadowy, but completely pitch black. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face. I couldn't see my parents. I couldn't see my sisters. The only thing I could hear was the water rushing around us and echoing off the tunnel walls. At first, we tried to stay calm. My parents told us to just keep floating and not panic. But then something changed. I started feeling my head brush against the ceiling. At first, it was just a light scrape like I was imagining it. But then it happened again and again. The ceiling was getting lower. The tunnel was narrowing slowly but unmistakably. The space between the water and the rock above us was shrinking. Then my mom's inner tube popped. I remember the sound clearly. A sudden sharp snap followed by a splash and her gasp. She disappeared slightly lower in the water, no longer supported the same way. Almost immediately after that, my sister's tubes popped too, then mine. Suddenly, we weren't floating anymore. We were being dragged. The current was strong, relentless. We were pressed against the bottom of the tunnel, scraping along whatever was down there. I could feel roots and rocks beneath me. I tried to curl my body, trying not to get caught on anything. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The darkness was absolute. Time stopped making sense. I had no idea how far we had gone or how much farther we had to go. All I knew was that the ceiling kept getting closer. At one point, the tunnel became so narrow that I flipped onto my back. The water forced me into that position. I could feel the rock ceiling scraping my nose. Every time the water surged, my face pressed harder against the stone above me. I tried to tilt my head, tried to find any space to breathe comfortably, but there wasn't much room. I was 7 years old, trapped in pitch-black water, being dragged through a narrowing tunnel with no control and no way out. No one screamed. That's the part that still sticks with me. We were all too scared. We were silent, focusing on breathing, focusing on not panicking, focusing on the hope that there would be an end to the tunnel. The water was loud, but our fear was louder inside our heads. It felt like forever. In reality, it was probably a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes. But in total darkness, with no sense of distance or time, it felt endless. It felt like we might just keep going until there was no air left, until the tunnel closed completely, until we all drowned together without ever seeing daylight again. Then, suddenly, we heard my dad's voice. He screamed that he could see the end. That sound, his voice breaking through the darkness, was the most relieving thing I have ever heard in my life. Moments later, light appeared ahead of us, small at first, then growing. The tunnel opened and we were thrown back into daylight. We made it out. We were scraped up, shaken and terrified, but alive. No one talked for a long time afterward. There was this heavy silence as we processed what had just happened. My parents were pale. My sisters were crying quietly. I remember sitting there, shivering, staring at the tunnel entrance we had just come out of, unable to believe we had survived it. That moment changed something in me. Even now, decades later, I can still feel the rocks scraping my face. I can still remember the silence, the darkness, the feeling of being pulled somewhere I didn't want to go with no control. I can still remember how small and helpless I felt. I don't do caves well anymore. Anything enclosed, anything dark and narrow, tunnels, crawl spaces, tight elevators. My chest tightens, my breath shortens, my body remembers, even if my mind tries to move on. What scares me most when I think back isn't just how dangerous it was, it's how casual the decision was, how easily we could have all died because something sounded fun, free, and harmless. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. No one would have known where to look, and in that tunnel, in that silence, all we had was hope that there would be an end. That memory never left me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for I had a C-section for my second child because I developed preeclampsia, and things had reached a point where my doctor made it very clear that the baby needed to come out immediately. There was no drama in how she said it, just calm certainty. I trusted her completely. She was an incredible doctor, one of those people who makes you feel safe simply by being in the room. At that point, I was scared, but also relieved that someone competent was taking control. The surgery itself started out feeling strangely normal. I was numb from the chest down, so there was no pain, just pressure and tugging sensations that felt distant, like they were happening to someone else. From my chest up, I felt fine. I could breathe easily, I could talk. The operating room was bright and busy, but relaxed. People were chatting casually. My doctor was talking to me while she worked, asking me questions, making jokes, keeping things light. Everyone seemed calm. Everything felt under control. At some point, while they were finishing up, while my doctor was literally putting me back together, I started to feel tired. Not regular tired, not the kind of tired where you yawn and think you could use a nap. This was different. It came on suddenly and completely, like someone had flipped a switch inside me. I remember thinking that I had never felt this tired in my entire life. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It felt deeper, heavier, like my entire being was sinking. All I wanted to do was sleep. What scared me later when I thought about it was that I didn't care about anything else. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel fear. I didn't even feel curiosity. I had no desire to see my baby. That thought didn't even register as important in that moment. There was just this overwhelming pull toward rest, toward letting go. The room started to feel very quiet. Not quiet like people stopped talking, but quiet like sound itself no longer mattered. The voices faded away. The clinking of instruments disappeared. The sense of activity around me dissolved. At the same time, I felt like my body was no longer fully attached to the table. It felt as if I was floating upward, slowly and gently, like a balloon being released. What's hard to explain is how good it felt. I wasn't happy in the way we usually define happiness. It wasn't excitement or joy or pleasure. It was something else entirely. It was relief. Absolute relief, like every worry, every fear, every responsibility I had ever carried was suddenly gone. There was no stress, no pain, no emotional weight. Everything felt resolved. Everything felt okay. More than okay. It was the most content I have ever felt in my life. I didn't have thoughts racing through my head. I didn't have memories flashing by. I wasn't thinking about my family or my life or anything I would leave behind. There was no regret. There was no attachment. There was just this deep, perfect calm, a sense that nothing mattered anymore because nothing needed to matter. I have never found words that truly describe it. Peace doesn't fully cover it. Bliss doesn't either. It was like being wrapped in the certainty that nothing could ever hurt you again, that nothing was required of you anymore. I felt like I was above my body. I don't know if my eyes were open or closed. I don't remember turning my head, but somehow I was aware of the room from above. I remember seeing the man who was monitoring my vitals. I remember him writing something down on a clipboard. I remember him glancing at the monitor, and then I heard him say it. Oh, shit. The tone of his voice cut through everything. It was sharp, panicked, urgent. It didn't feel like it belonged in that calm space I was in. I watched him move quickly, and suddenly there was movement everywhere. Someone rushed toward me. I felt something cold go into my IV. Then there was a sound in my head. The only way I can describe it is like a gunshot, going off inside my skull. Instantly, violently, I was slammed back into my body. It felt like being dropped from a height and crashing into yourself. All the noise came rushing back at once. Voices, machines, the beeping of monitors, the brightness of the lights, the weight of my body on the table. I was wide awake, and my body started shaking uncontrollably. I wasn't cold, but I had intense chills. My teeth were chattering. My muscles were trembling so hard I couldn't stop them. It felt like every nerve in my body was firing at once. People were talking to me, but I couldn't focus. Everything felt chaotic and overwhelming compared to where I had just been. After that, things are blurry. I know I was conscious, but I don't remember much of that night. It's like pieces of it are missing. I know I was moved. I know people checked on me, but the details are gone, like my brain decided it didn't need to keep them. The next day, a nurse came into my room and asked me if the blood transfusion team had come by yet. I remember being confused. I told her no one had come. She looked surprised and left the room. A little while later, she came back with my doctor. My doctor sat down and apologized to me. She told me that during the surgery, while they were closing me up, I had started bleeding heavily, more than they expected. They were struggling to get it under control. She told me I had lost over half of my total blood volume. over half. She explained it calmly, clinically, like she was telling me about a lab result. She said they eventually managed to stop the bleeding, but that I had been in very serious danger, that my body had gone into shock. Suddenly, everything made sense. The exhaustion, the floating, the silence, the peace. The next day after that, nurses kept commenting on how much better I looked. One of them laughed and said they were surprised I had even been able to walk the first day. They said it casually, like it was a funny anecdote. Inside, I was screaming, "What the fuck is funny about that?" No one had told me I was dying. No one had told me how close I had been. I hadn't even received a blood transfusion until many hours later. I had been lying there, smiling, floating, content, while my body was shutting down. And the worst part wasn't the fear. The worst part was that I knew now. I knew what dying felt like. And it wasn't scary, it was beautiful. That realization changed everything. Because once you've felt that kind of peace, nothing in normal life compares to it. No happiness, no success, no love. Nothing I have experienced since even comes close. I don't say that lightly. I don't say it dramatically. It's just the truth of how it feels inside me. I didn't see lights. I didn't see dead relatives. I didn't have a life review. But I did experience that separation, that lifting, that sense of leaving the body behind. I believe people when they say they died and came back. Because something happened to me that day that medicine alone doesn't fully explain. Since then, my life has been hard in ways I never expected. I've had major health problems. I've had cancer. I've lost my reproductive system. Both of my parents are dead. I'm only in my early 30s, and sometimes it feels like I've already lived a lifetime of loss. And layered on top of all of that is this quiet, persistent feeling that I don't belong here anymore. I wake up every day and go through the motions. I love my children. I take care of my responsibilities. I function. But inside, there's this deep ache, a sense that I already left once, and coming back wasn't part of the plan. I struggle with purpose. I struggle with joy. I struggle with feeling connected to the world. And I don't think I will ever truly feel whole again until I die for real. That thought scares me. Not because I want to die, but because I know what it feels like to leave. And I know how good it felt. And knowing that makes staying so much harder. I keep going. I don't have a choice. My kids need me. Life keeps moving. But there is a part of me that stayed on that table, floating above, wrapped in peace. And I don't know if that part will ever fully come back. That's the part I live with now. When I was very young, probably 6 or 7 years old, my family took a trip that required us to pass through a small town where one of my mom's close friends lived. Because it was a long drive and we didn't want to stay in a hotel, we spent the night at his house with his wife. At that age, I didn't really understand adult friendships or history, but I knew this man was important to my mom. My mom, back in those days, was deeply involved in activism. She was what people would call a hippie in the most genuine sense. She believed strongly in human rights, equality, peace, and social justice. She attended protests, helped organize events, and surrounded herself with people who shared those values. This man was one of those people. They had planned and attended protests together, marched together, and spent countless hours talking about how to make the world a better place. To my mom, he wasn't just a friend. He was someone she trusted deeply, someone she believed in. As a child, I didn't know any of that history. All I knew was how he treated us. He was gentle. That's the word that comes back to me again and again. He spoke softly, moved calmly, and always seemed relaxed. There was nothing intimidating or harsh about him at all. He had a kind face and warm eyes. He laughed easily and listened when people talked. When we arrived at his home, he welcomed us like family, not like guests who were an inconvenience. One small detail from that night has stayed with me more clearly than almost anything else. My brother and I were kids, and like most kids, we loved sugary cereal. At home, we weren't really allowed to have it. My mom was strict about food, very health-focused, very conscious of what we ate. So sugary cereal was basically a forbidden luxury. This man knew that. Despite the fact that we were only staying for one night, he went out of his way to buy a box or two of sugary cereal just for us. I remember waking up and seeing it on the table. Brightly colored boxes that felt almost magical to us. It might seem like a small thing, but to a child, it meant a lot. It made me feel seen. It made me feel like he cared about our happiness, even in tiny, simple ways. That was who he was in my mind. A peaceful activist, a gentleman, someone who believed in kindness and showed it through his actions. We stayed one night, thanked them, and continued on our trip. Life moved on. I didn't think much about him after that, not because he wasn't important, but because I was a child and the world is always full of new things at that age. Then, a year or two later, something changed. I remember my mom crying, not just tearing up, but truly crying in a way that felt heavy and frightening. She tried to hide it from us at first. She would go into another room, or turn away, or wipe her face quickly if she thought we were watching. My brother and I knew something was wrong, but she wouldn't tell us what it was. At that age, when your parent is clearly upset but refuses to explain why, your imagination fills in the gaps. We kept asking. We kept pushing. Eventually, she told us. She said that her friend and his wife had died. She told us it seemed like a bear attack in the mountains. Even as a child, that explanation sounded scary, but also strangely distant. Bears exist. Accidents happen. It felt tragic, but not impossible. I remember feeling sad, mostly because my mom was so upset. I didn't fully grasp death yet, not in a permanent, life-altering way. I just knew that someone who had been kind to us was gone, and that my mom had lost a friend she cared deeply about. We accepted that explanation and moved on. Years passed. I grew up. I became a teenager, then an adult. That night, that man, that cereal, all faded into the background of my memory. Just another strange, sad story from childhood. Then, many years later, I learned the truth. I don't remember exactly how it came up. Maybe my mom finally felt we were old enough to know. Maybe it slipped out in conversation. Maybe someone else mentioned it and my mom had to explain. What I do remember is the moment when everything I thought I knew about that situation shattered. My mom hadn't told us the truth. There had been no bear attack. What actually happened was far worse and far more disturbing. That man, the gentle activist, the one who fought for human rights and peace, had committed a murder-suicide, not with his wife. With another woman. From what I learned, he had gone to a cabin in the mountains with one of his female friends. It's unclear to this day whether they were having an affair or if the relationship was something else entirely. What is clear is that something went terribly wrong. He set the woman's cabin on fire. Then after killing her, he killed himself with a knife. He left behind a note for his wife. The note was short, simple, apologetic. "I'm so sorry," followed by her name. That was it. When I learned this, I felt physically sick. My mind immediately went back to that night we stayed at his house, to the way he smiled, the way he spoke softly, the way he bought cereal for two kids he barely knew, the way my mom trusted him, believed in him, and admired him. I couldn't reconcile those two versions of him. On one hand, there was the man I remembered, kind, gentle, peaceful, someone who actively tried to make the world better, someone who stood against violence and injustice, someone who preached compassion. On the other hand, there was this act of extreme violence, fire, murder, suicide, destruction not just of lives, but of families, of trust, of everything people believed about him. What scared me most wasn't just the act itself. It was the contradiction. It was the realization that someone can be genuinely kind, genuinely caring, genuinely committed to good causes, and still be capable of something unimaginably horrific. That the line between good people and bad people isn't always clear. That sometimes the people who seem the safest, the most gentle, the most moral, are hiding something broken and dangerous inside. I think about his wife often, even though I never knew her. I think about receiving that note, about losing her husband in such a violent, public, incomprehensible way, about finding out he had killed someone else before killing himself, about having to carry that knowledge for the rest of her life. I think about my mom, too, about how she chose to lie to us, not because she wanted to deceive us, but because she wanted to protect us. She didn't want her children carrying that kind of fear, that kind of confusion, at such a young age. She wanted us to remember him as the kind man who bought us cereal, not as the person he became at the end. Looking back, I understand why she did it. But knowing the truth now has changed how I see people. It has made me realize how little we truly know about anyone, no matter how close we think we are, how carefully curated the versions of ourselves we show to the world can be, how darkness can exist alongside kindness, sometimes completely hidden. That's the part that still unsettles me the most. Not the fire, not the knife, not even the death, but the fact that a man who spent his life trying to make the world better could also be capable of destroying it in such a personal, violent way. It makes you question how well you really know anyone. It makes you question how thin the line is between peace and violence. And it makes you realize that sometimes the scariest truths are the ones that force you to accept that people are far more complex and far more dangerous than we want to believe. Earlier this year, my boyfriend, a close friend, and I took a trip through rural Texas, about 3 hours east of El Paso. It was one of those places that feels almost forgotten by time. Semi-deserted, dry, flat, and quiet, in a way that feels unnatural. The area is known mostly because a famous artist worked there in the 1970s, so now it's sort of an art destination, but that doesn't mean it's populated. There's basically one small town, and even calling it a town feels generous. One stoplight, that's it. One intersection with a blinking signal in something like a 30-mile radius. During the day, the place felt strange but interesting. Empty buildings, long stretches of road with nothing on either side but scrubland and low desert plants. You could drive for miles without seeing another car. It was eerie but manageable. At night, it became something else entirely. That's when the fear set in. We were driving outside the main town after dark, trying to get back to where we were staying. The roads out there don't make much sense if you're not familiar with them. No clear signage, no streetlights, just long, straight roads disappearing into pitch-black nothingness. At some point, we realized we were lost. I was driving. My boyfriend was in the passenger seat, and our friend was sitting in the back. We were moving very slowly, maybe 2 miles per hour, creeping along with our brights on because it was so dark that the headlights felt like they were being swallowed by the night. The sky was black. No moon, no stars, no glow from any nearby town, just darkness in every direction. I glanced down at my phone to try to get the GPS to load. Service was spotty at best. I remember feeling tense but not panicked yet. Lost, yes, but still calm enough to think we'd just turn around once the map loaded. Then everything happened at once. Our friend in the back seat suddenly screamed. Not a startled gasp, not a nervous, "What was that?" It was a full-on scream, the kind that comes from pure terror, the kind that makes your blood turn cold instantly. Before my brain could even process why she was screaming, my boyfriend and I both looked up. Right against the backseat window, someone had shined an extremely bright flashlight directly into the car. Not a normal flashlight. It was harsh and blinding, like an industrial-strength beam. It filled the interior of the car in a way that felt aggressive, intentional. Then I saw him. About 5 feet in front of the hood of the car, slightly off to the right, stood a man. He was wearing a ski mask. Over that, a black bandana covered the lower half of his face. You couldn't see a single identifying feature. No eyes, no skin, nothing human. He was holding a shotgun, not slung over his shoulder, not resting casually. He was brandishing it, holding it in a way that made it very clear he knew what he was doing and wanted us to know he had power in that moment. For a split second, time froze. We were in the middle of nowhere, absolutely nowhere. No houses, no businesses, no lights, no other cars, just us, alone on a dark road in a rental sedan with Florida plates, completely out of place, completely vulnerable. My mind raced through every possibility, and none of them were good. We weren't threatening anyone. We weren't trespassing on property that we knew of. We weren't driving aggressively. We were crawling along, clearly lost. The only things that made us stand out were that we were outsiders and that we were alone. Robbery crossed my mind immediately. So did something worse. There was no time to think it through. Pure instinct took over. I slammed my foot down on the gas as hard as I could. The engine roared and the car lurched forward. The road was uneven and poorly maintained. Loose dirt and gravel in places, and for a horrifying second, the tires struggled to grip. I remember thinking that if we spun out, if the car lost control, if we stalled, this was it. All 3 of us ducked down instinctively. I was barely peering over the steering wheel, my body pressed low, my hands white-knuckled around it. I was praying silently, desperately, that we wouldn't be shot at, that we wouldn't hear a gunshot, that the windshield wouldn't explode. The headlights jolted past where he stood, and then suddenly he was gone, swallowed by the darkness behind us. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I drove like my life depended on it, because in that moment it absolutely felt like it did. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking on the wheel. My boyfriend kept telling me to keep going, not to stop, not to look back. Our friend was crying in the back seat, trying to catch her breath, her voice breaking as she kept saying she thought we were going to die. We didn't talk about what we'd just seen. We didn't analyze it. We just focused on getting back to town. When we finally reached the outskirts of the main area, the relief was overwhelming but fragile. The presence of a few dim lights felt like safety, even though rationally we knew it didn't guarantee anything. I pulled over once we were somewhere that didn't feel completely isolated, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone when I dialed 911. I told the dispatcher everything, where we were, what we saw, a masked man, a shotgun, a flashlight shining into our car, how close he was, how we fled. There was a pause on the line. Then the dispatcher said casually, "They were probably just hunting." I remember staring at the dashboard in disbelief. Hunting. At night. On a dark road. With a ski mask and bandana, standing directly in front of a car and shining a flashlight into the back seat. I asked if they were going to send someone out. If they were going to check it out. If they needed more details. They didn't seem particularly concerned. The call ended, and I sat there in silence, my heart still racing, my body still flooded with adrenaline. To this day, what scares me the most isn't just the encounter itself. It's how easily it was dismissed. How quickly something that felt like a life-or-death situation to us was brushed off as nothing. Maybe the dispatcher was right. Maybe the guy really was hunting. But even if that's true, the way he approached us, the way he masked himself, the way he blocked the road, the way he shined that light into our car, none of it felt normal or safe. We were 3 people, lost, driving slowly, clearly not a threat. And in the middle of nowhere, someone decided to confront us with a shotgun. That moment changed how I think about empty places, about rural roads, about being lost, about how quickly things can turn dangerous when there's no one around to see or help. We were lucky. We got away. And sometimes that's the only explanation there is. Sometime around the early 2000s, when I was still a kid in school, something happened that permanently changed how I looked at food, factories, and the idea of what can be hidden inside everyday things. At the time, it felt like one of those rumors that kids pass around at school, the kind that sound too horrible to be true. But this one wasn't just a rumor. It turned out to be very real, and even now, years later, thinking about it still makes my stomach turn. It started quietly, the way most truly disturbing stories do. News broke that somewhere outside our school, a person had opened a can of tuna and found something that definitely wasn't tuna. Inside the can was a human ear, not cartilage from a fish, not something that could be mistaken for food. A real, unmistakable human ear. At first, adults tried to downplay it. Teachers told us it was probably fake or exaggerated. Some parents said it was just a hoax or a misunderstanding. But then, a couple of weeks later, another report surfaced. This time, someone had found part of a human finger in their canned tuna. A digit, skin, bone, tissue. And what made it even worse was that the ear and the finger did not come from the same person. That detail alone made the situation far more terrifying. Even more disturbing was the fact that no one had been reported missing. There were no open missing persons cases that matched the body parts. No reports of industrial accidents, no explanation. Just pieces of human beings appearing in sealed cans of food that had been shipped, sold, and eaten by who knows how many people. The tuna itself came from a massive supplier. This company didn't operate a single factory. Instead, it sold bulk, pre-cooked tuna to countless brands and distributors. Those distributors then packaged it under different labels and sold it all over the place. The supply chain was so tangled that at first, no one could even tell where the contaminated tuna had originated. For weeks, everything was confusion. At school, this was all anyone talked about. Kids repeated the story over and over, adding new details each time. Some said entire limbs had been found. Others said whole bodies were missing. No one knew what was true yet, but fear doesn't need facts to spread. It just needs possibility. I remember standing in the lunch line one day, staring at a huge plastic tub of tuna mayonnaise sitting on the buffet counter. It was one of those bulk containers meant to feed dozens of students. The tuna inside wasn't mixed very well. You could see stringy clumps, pale pink chunks, darker bits, strange textures. I remember thinking it had never looked so disgusting before. At that point, there still hadn't been a proper recall. No official announcement had reached schools yet. So the tuna was still being served. People were joking nervously, daring each other to eat it, saying things like, "What if you get the ear?" or "Imagine biting into a finger." But underneath the jokes, there was real unease. I just stood there staring at the tuna, my imagination running completely wild. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Thin, vein-like strands, odd lumps. My brain filled in the blanks in the worst way possible. I couldn't bring myself to eat it. I walked away hungry that day. Weeks passed before the full truth finally came out. Investigators eventually traced the contaminated tuna back to a specific fish processing plant. What they found there was far worse than anyone had expected. The factory had been hiring dozens of illegal Chinese migrant workers. These workers were living and working under conditions that could only be described as modern-day slavery. They were paid almost nothing, housed in cramped and unsanitary conditions, and forced to work long, exhausting shifts using old, extremely dangerous machinery. The machines they worked with were massive industrial processors designed to chop, grind, and process enormous quantities of fish quickly. Safety measures were outdated or non-existent. Workers were exhausted, overworked, and terrified of speaking up because they were undocumented and controlled by people who threatened them with deportation, violence, or worse. At some point, 2 of these workers fell into one of the large processing machines. Whether it was an accident caused by exhaustion, faulty equipment, or unsafe working conditions, no one knows for sure. What is known is that both men were killed almost instantly. Their bodies were processed along with the tuna. By the time anyone realized they were missing, it was already too late. Their remains had already been chopped, cooked, mixed, canned, and shipped out to distributors. From there, the cans went to stores, schools, cafeterias, and homes. The factory owners knew what had happened, and they chose to do nothing. Reporting the deaths would have exposed their illegal workforce. It would have uncovered a broader human trafficking network that supplied them with undocumented labor. It would have destroyed their business and likely sent them to prison. So instead, they stayed silent. They continued operations as if nothing had happened. No missing persons report was filed because the workers were undocumented. No one came looking for them. No families were contacted. To the system, it was as if those men had never existed. The only reason the truth came out at all was because small, unmistakable pieces of human remains began appearing in people's food weeks later. By the time authorities intervened, most of the tuna from that batch had already been consumed. Investigators recovered the ear, the finger, a few other fragments, but the vast majority of the remains were never found. That meant only one thing: people had eaten them, unknowingly, unwittingly. Families, children, entire communities had consumed food that contained parts of 2 human beings without ever realizing it. That realization haunted me. As a kid, it shattered my sense of safety in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. Food was supposed to be safe. Canned food especially felt clean, controlled, regulated. The idea that something so horrifying could slip through unnoticed made me realize how fragile those assumptions were. For years after that, I couldn't eat canned tuna. Even the smell made my stomach turn. Every time I saw it on a shelf, I remembered that lunch line, that tub of poorly mixed tuna. The way my imagination had gone wild before I even knew how bad the truth really was. Even now, thinking about it makes my skin crawl. What stays with me most isn't just the shock of the story. It's the human cost that almost went completely unseen. 2 men died horribly alone, far from home, and were erased so thoroughly that the only trace they left behind was found inside cans of food weeks later. No memorial, no names remembered, no justice for what they endured, just silence, fear, and a lesson I learned far too young about what can happen when human lives are treated as disposable. To this day, that story reminds me that sometimes the most disturbing truths aren't hidden in dark alleys or scary places. Sometimes they're sitting quietly on a grocery store shelf, looking completely ordinary, waiting for someone to open the lid. It was sometime around 1997 or 1998, when I was in middle school, that this story took place. At that age, everything feels awkward already. You are old enough to notice differences between people, but not old enough to fully understand them. Social groups form quickly, often for no real reason, and once someone is placed outside of those groups, it can be almost impossible for them to get back in. At the start of that school year, there was a girl in my class that I had noticed but didn't really know. She was quiet in a way that made her easy to overlook. She didn't raise her hand much, didn't talk loudly, didn't draw attention to herself. If you weren't paying attention, you could forget she was even there. She had mastered the art of taking up as little space as possible. Like many middle schools, ours had an unspoken social structure. Some kids were popular, some were average, and some fell into that unfortunate category of being different enough to stand out but not confident enough to defend themselves. This girl fell into that last group. She didn't have close friends, and because of that, a few classmates decided she was an easy target. It was never anything dramatic or openly violent, at least not that I saw. It was small things, whispers, laughing when she walked by, eye rolls, notes passed behind her back, the kind of cruelty that adults often dismiss because it doesn't leave visible bruises, but the kind that slowly wears a person down. That kind of behavior has always made me uncomfortable. Even as a kid, it bothered me deeply when someone who hadn't done anything wrong was treated badly. I've always been naturally kind, or at least inclined to try to be. So I started talking to her. We never became best friends. It wasn't like we suddenly spent every moment together, but we talked. We passed notes in class. Sometimes we'd talk on the phone after school, mostly about normal kid stuff, school, teachers, music, nothing deep. At first, we never hung out outside of school, and there were a couple reasons for that. One was simply that we weren't that close, but the bigger reason came up gradually during our conversations. Her parents were extremely strict. She mentioned that she wasn't allowed to go anywhere except school and church. No hanging out at friends' houses, no going to the mall, no just walking around the neighborhood. I never met her parents, but from what she said, it was clear they were deeply religious and very controlling. She didn't describe them as cruel directly, but the rules she lived under were intense. She wasn't allowed to wear certain clothes. She couldn't wear makeup at all. She wasn't allowed to attend social events like school dances or parties. Even normal teenage things were off limits. At the time, I didn't fully understand how damaging that could be. I felt bad for her, but I also assumed that was just how her family lived. I chalked it up to religion and conservative parenting. Plenty of parents were strict in the 90s, and as a kid, you don't always question adults the way you should. One moment that sticks out to me, even now, happened when she missed a few days of school. I offered to bring her homework to her house so she wouldn't fall behind. I remember her reaction clearly. She panicked, not in an angry way, but in a scared way. She immediately said no, very firmly, and explained that she wasn't allowed to have people over unless her parents knew them very well. Something about that response didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just a rule, it felt like fear. Her house was on one of the main roads in our city, and I passed it several times a week. Over time, I started to notice how strange it looked. The house always felt empty, even though I knew people lived there. No one was ever outside. The garage door was never open. There were no cars in the driveway. At night, there was no warm glow from the windows. It always looked dark and still, like no one was home. As kids, we don't always trust our instincts. We notice things, but we don't know what to do with those observations. I noticed. I felt uneasy, but I didn't know how to put it into words or who to tell or whether it even mattered. As the school year went on, summer was getting closer. There weren't many days left. Then one morning, everything changed. We walked into our classroom like we always did, expecting a normal day. Our teacher was usually cheerful and energetic. That morning, she wasn't smiling. She looked serious, almost shaken. Standing next to her was the school counselor. They told us that the girl had passed away. They didn't give details. They spoke carefully, but they hinted that it was suicide. The room went silent. No one knew how to react. At that time, suicide wasn't something we heard about often, especially not involving kids our age. It felt unreal, like they were talking about someone else. Later, details started spreading through the community. People talked. Parents whispered. Eventually, the truth came out. She had taken her own life. She had left a note. In it, she wrote about how her parents treated her and how alone she felt, how she didn't have friends, how trapped she felt. School counselors started pulling students aside, one by one, to talk. When I spoke to mine, I mentioned the strange things she had said during our phone conversations, the rules, the fear, the isolation. At the time, it felt too late, like all of it should have mattered before. What haunted me most wasn't just her death, but what must have been happening inside that house, behind closed doors, in that dark, quiet place that always looked lifeless from the outside. I started imagining her alone in her room, day after day, with no escape, no support, no one to tell her that things could change. Once I got my own car in high school, I started avoiding that road entirely. I'd take a longer route just so I wouldn't have to pass her house. Every time I thought about it, my mind went to terrible places. I pictured her suffering. I pictured the moments leading up to her death. I wondered what I could have done differently. What if I had told someone sooner? What if I had taken her fear more seriously? What if I had pushed harder to help? Those questions don't have answers, but they still linger. As an adult now, looking back, I understand so much more than I did then. I understand how isolation can crush a person, how strict control can become abuse, how silence can be deadly, and how easy it is for warning signs to be missed when they don't fit a clear pattern. She wasn't loud about her pain. She didn't act out. She didn't rebel. She faded quietly. And because of that, she slipped through the cracks. I think about her often, even all these years later, about how young she was, about how little she got to experience, about how many adults failed her, even if they didn't mean to. That story stays with me as a reminder. Kindness matters. Listening matters. And when something feels wrong, it usually is. I wish I had known then what I know now. I wish someone had seen her more clearly. Most of all, I wish she had known that she mattered, that her life had value, and that the world could have been bigger than the walls closing in around her. This happened a few years ago, and even now, when I think back on it, I still don't fully understand what that man wanted from me. I don't know what his intentions were, and I probably never will. What I do know is that the experience left a mark on me. It made me realize how unprepared I was for a situation like that, how quickly fear can take over, and how easily things can turn dangerous without warning. Some of the details are a little unclear now, blurred by time and adrenaline, but the feeling of that night is something I remember very clearly. I had been spending the evening at a friend's place. He lived only about 5 minutes away from my own home, just around the corner. We had known each other for a long time, and whenever we hung out, we always talked longer than we planned to. That night was no different. We talked about random things, joked around, and lost track of time without even realizing it. Before I knew it, it was already around 1 in the morning. I decided it was time to head home. It was late, and I had things to do the next day. We said our goodbyes, and I stepped outside into the night. It had been raining, and the streets were wet and quiet. The rain wasn't heavy anymore, but everything was damp. The pavement reflected the streetlights, and the air felt cold and heavy. There was that familiar late-night stillness, the kind where it feels like the world has slowed down and most people are already asleep. My friend walked with me part of the way, since we lived close to each other. We talked casually as we walked, not really thinking about anything other than getting home. The neighborhood was one I knew well. I had walked those streets countless times, both during the day and at night. I felt comfortable there, safe in the way you do when you're close to home. We reached a street corner that was probably no more than a minute away from my front door. I could almost picture myself unlocking my door, getting out of my wet jacket, and finally relaxing. That's when we heard someone call out to us from behind. At first, I didn't think much of it. People ask for directions sometimes, even late at night. But when I turned around, I saw a man on a bright yellow bicycle. The color of the bike stood out immediately in the dim streetlight. It was almost too bright for the quiet, dark street. The man looked strange. He wasn't wearing a jacket, even though it was cold and had been raining. His clothes were soaked, and there were small splatters of mud on his face and arms. His hair was wet and messy, and he looked exhausted, almost frantic. He was breathing heavily, as if he had been riding fast or had been out in the rain for a long time. He called out to us again, asking for help. Without really thinking, I stopped. Looking back, this is the part that makes me feel foolish. I didn't assess the situation properly. I didn't listen to my instincts. I just assumed someone needed help, and I reacted automatically. I asked him what he needed help with. He looked straight at me and said, "Please, you must come with me." The way he said it made me uncomfortable. It was urgent but vague. There was no explanation, no context, just a demand. I asked again what he needed help with, expecting him to explain or at least point somewhere. Instead, he repeated the exact same sentence. "Please, you must come with me." At that point, alarm bells started going off in my head. I told him I wasn't going anywhere unless he told me what he needed help with and where he wanted to take me. I tried to keep my voice calm, but inside I was already nervous. He seemed to get frustrated. His tone changed slightly, sharper, more aggressive. But instead of explaining anything, he just repeated himself again, almost like a broken record. That's when I decided I needed to leave. I started to slowly step backward, trying not to provoke him, trying to create some distance between us. I remember thinking that if I just kept backing away, this would end and we could walk off. He noticed immediately. In one sudden movement, he grabbed my arm. His grip was much stronger than I expected. He pulled me toward him with force, close enough that I could see his eyes clearly. They were wide and intense, almost wild. My heart started pounding. Then he started shouting at me. He yelled things that didn't seem to make sense, jumping from one sentence to another. He swore at me, asking how many languages I spoke. He talked about things he had seen, about brothers he had lost. His voice was loud, angry, and unpredictable. He asked if I thought he was going to hurt me, his face inches from mine. I didn't know how to respond. My mind went completely blank. I've never been good with confrontation. I've lived a relatively sheltered life, and I had never been in a situation like this before. I didn't know what to say, what to do, or how to react. I just froze. As the seconds passed, his grip tightened around my arm. It hurt, but more than that, it terrified me. I remember feeling completely powerless, like I had lost control of my own body. I was aware of everything around me, but I couldn't make myself move or speak. Then, across the street, I noticed someone approaching on the pavement. I don't know if the man saw them too or just sensed movement, but his grip loosened slightly. That tiny change was enough. The moment I felt his hold weaken, I pulled away and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't shout. I didn't try to confront him or call for help. I just ran as fast as I could toward my front door. My heart was racing, my breath felt shallow, and my legs felt like they might give out at any second. I got inside and locked the door behind me. Only then did the fear fully hit me. My hands were shaking and I felt sick to my stomach. I replayed the encounter over and over in my head, wondering what would have happened if no one had walked by, if he hadn't loosened his grip, if I hadn't managed to get away. For a long time afterward, I felt ashamed. Ashamed that I froze. Ashamed that I didn't fight back or say something smarter. Ashamed that I just took the verbal abuse and allowed someone to grab me without doing anything. But as time passed, I began to understand something important. Freezing is not weakness. It's a natural response to fear. I didn't know what would have happened if I hadn't run, and that uncertainty is the scariest part of all. I may never know what that man wanted, but I know that night could have ended very differently. Even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes when I walk home late at night. It changed the way I see the world, the way I assess situations, and the way I trust strangers. It taught me that danger doesn't always look obvious, and that sometimes survival means running away. I first heard this story many years ago during a history class, and even now it still returns to me in the form of nightmares. There are certain stories that never leave you once you learn them, no matter how much time passes. This is one of those stories. It is difficult to read, difficult to imagine, and even more difficult to accept as something that truly happened. Yet it did. The events surrounding Mary Turner are not a legend or a rumor. They are a documented part of American history, and that fact alone makes the story even more disturbing. Mary Turner was a young black woman born in 1899 in Brooks County, Georgia. Her parents were Perry Graham and Elizabeth Johnson. She grew up during a time when the South was ruled by fear, racial violence, and an unspoken rule that black lives could be taken without consequence. By the time Mary was 19 years old, she was married and pregnant, hoping for a future that most people her age naturally dream of. Instead, her life would end in a way so brutal that it shocked even those who were accustomed to violence. Mary's husband, Hayes Turner, was a black man living under the same oppressive system that controlled every part of black life in the South at that time. The couple lived in a community where white landowners held absolute power and where black workers had little to no protection under the law. One of the most feared men in the area was a white planter named Hampton Smith. Hampton Smith was widely known for his cruelty. He routinely abused and beat the black workers on his plantation. Violence was his method of control, and he used it freely. He also relied heavily on convict labor, a system that allowed white landowners to exploit black men who had been arrested for minor offenses. One such man was an 18-year-old black teenager named Sidney Johnson. Sidney Johnson had been convicted of playing dice, a small offense that resulted in a $30 fine. Hampton Smith paid that fine, but it was not an act of kindness. In exchange, Johnson was forced to work on Smith's plantation. During his time there, Johnson was beaten multiple times. One of the most severe beatings occurred when Johnson refused to work while he was sick. Smith showed no mercy. To him, black workers were disposable. Smith also had a history with Mary Turner and her husband. At one point, Hayes Turner threatened Smith for beating Mary. Instead of Smith facing consequences for his violence, Hayes was punished. He was sentenced to the chain gang, a brutal form of forced labor that broke many men physically and mentally. This was the reality of justice in the South at the time. On the evening of May 16, 1918, Hampton Smith was shot and killed on his plantation. The man responsible was Sidney Johnson. After years of abuse, something inside Johnson finally broke. Smith's death sent shockwaves through the white community, not because a life had been lost, but because a black man had dared to kill a white landowner. What followed was not an investigation or a legal process. It was a mob-driven manhunt fueled by rage, fear, and racism. For an entire week, white mobs roamed the area searching for Sidney Johnson. During this time, at least 13 people were killed. Many of them had nothing to do with Smith's death. Their only crime was being black. Among those killed was Hayes Turner. On the morning of May 18, 1918, he was arrested and taken into custody. There was no evidence linking him to Smith's murder. That did not matter. Later that same day, a mob seized Hayes from custody and lynched him. He was murdered without a trial, without proof, and without mercy. When Mary learned of her husband's death, she was devastated. She was 8 months pregnant, grieving, and surrounded by terror. But instead of remaining silent, Mary did something incredibly brave. She publicly denied that her husband had any involvement in Hampton Smith's killing. She spoke out against the mob and openly condemned the lynching of her husband. Mary went even further. She threatened to have members of the mob arrested. In a time when black people were expected to remain silent and submissive, declaring such intent was seen as an unforgivable act of defiance. Her words alone were enough to seal her fate. The mob quickly turned its attention to Mary. They were enraged not only by her refusal to accept her husband's murder, but by her courage in speaking out. They decided she needed to be taught a lesson, not just for herself, but as a warning to others. Mary tried to escape. Knowing she was in danger, she fled, hoping to find safety somewhere beyond the reach of the mob. But there was nowhere to hide. She was eventually found and captured. The mob took Mary to Folsom Bridge. What happened there remains one of the most horrifying acts of racial violence ever recorded in American history. Mary was tied upside down to a tree. Gasoline and motor oil were poured over her body. She was still alive when they set her on fire. As if that were not enough, while Mary was burning, one member of the mob stepped forward and used a knife to cut open her abdomen. Her unborn child fell to the ground. Witnesses later reported that the baby cried. Moments later, the child was crushed underfoot. Mary's suffering did not end there. Afterward, her body was shot repeatedly. Hundreds of bullets were fired into her remains. Only then did the mob cut her down. Mary Turner and her child were buried near the tree. There was no marker, no headstone, only a whiskey bottle placed on the grave. The sheer brutality of the murders caused a brief national outcry. Newspapers across the country reported on the incident. Some expressed shock. Others tried to downplay the violence. Despite the attention, no one was held accountable. No arrests were made. No justice was served. Following the lynchings of Hayes and Mary Turner, many black residents fled the area. Even then, white mobs threatened to kill anyone who tried to leave. Entire families escaped under the cover of darkness, knowing that staying could mean death. Today, Mary Turner's story remains a painful reminder of a time when speaking the truth could get you killed, and when the law existed only to protect those in power. Her courage, even in the face of unimaginable terror, stands as a testament to human dignity. Remembering, if tonight's stories stayed with you, leave a like. Subscribe if you're drawn to the quiet kind of horror, the kind that doesn't need to shout. Some things don't chase you, they just wait. This is LURK. I'll see you next time.